So good morning, everybody. I think we will get started now while more people enter. But yes, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you to today's webinar, with which we aim to kick off the second phase of the Boreal Ecosystem Recovery and Assessment Project, or short, BERA. My name is Julia Linke, and I'm the science coordinator for BERA. And I'll be the host today. And I just want to let you know that I'm recording this event and will make available later via our website. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we all join today from many different places and backgrounds across and beyond the country, and across a diversity of organizations, institutions, and companies. And while we're meeting on a virtual platform today, we want to acknowledge that the research we will be discussing today will be mainly undertaken within the boundaries of the territories of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, as well as the Haldeman Tract land promised to the Six Nations. And also all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have lived, traveled, and gathered on these lands for thousands of years. We are pleased to have you all here today to hear about the accomplishments that have been achieved so far by the BERA project, but also most of all to launch officially the start of another 5 years of active research. Research that we would like to emphasize would not be possible without the generous support of the National Science and Engineering Research Council, or short NSERC, the Natural Resources Canada, Alberta Pacific Forest Industries, Cenovus Energy, ConocoPhillips Canada, Canadian Natural Resources, Imperial Oil, the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, as well as all the fruitful engagements that we have from our collaborators across also a span of networks or organizations such as the Alberta government, the Regional Industry Caribou Collaboration, the Alberta Energy Regulator, OGL Engineering, the Athabasca University, and Ludwigs-Maximilian University, Germany. So with this, I want to say welcome again. I'm happy to see you all here participating to the official launch of BERA Phase 2. And with this, I would like to turn it over to Greg McDermott, the main principal investigator of BERA. Greg, please, you can take it from here.
Okay, hello everybody. Good to see you. Actually, good to see some real faces. When I do this with students, I'm mostly just looking at black screens, and that is super awkward. But I think we're probably getting used to this whole virtual meeting thing, but I just want to remind you of a couple of things. When I'm presenting, when other people are presenting, I kind of lose track of people in the room and what they might be, trying to say. So I think that we probably should review a strategy for how we're going to perhaps interject or raise questions. So we have a number of people in the room. I think Julie is our main host. And I think that what we'll try and do is get through the presentations without interruptions. I mean, I personally don't mind being interrupted, but I just remind you, if you're trying to interject, you'll probably need to ask Julia to do it for me or do it for you. Otherwise, I won't notice. Eventually, we're going to get to a discussion part of the morning, and then we can be a little bit more interactive. But that's just one of the odd things about this type of meeting that I'm sure you're all aware of. Okay, so let me share my screen here, and we can get started. How's that looking, Julia? We got thumbs up?
Thumbs up.
Okay. All right. So yeah, my job here is to kind of run through an introduction to the webinar this morning and introduce you to the BERA research program. So these are the goals for the webinar. So like I said, I want to introduce you to BERA and a summary of what we accomplished in its first phase, which ran from 2015 to 2020. So I'll give you a little bit of history. I'll talk about some of the major achievements, because this really provides the foundation for what we want to achieve in the second phase of BERA, which is 2021 to 2026. So when we think of BERA research objectives and deliverables, we organize them into themes. So we have these 4 themes within BERA: vegetation, soils and hydrology, human and wildlife, and remote sensing. So we'll eventually get to the more detailed descriptions of objectives and deliverables, and I'm going to get some help from the co-PIs in that task. But first, I want to take a few minutes to introduce our research program in general. Now, I hope you don't mind me using a satellite image to introduce you to the Alberta Boreal Forest. This is a familiar view for me, at least, and I think it's a nice way to summarize the things that we have going on inside of BERA. So this is an overview of one of BERA's main research sites. This is Kirby near the town of Lac La Biche, and you can see that it's a pretty busy landscape with lots of industrial activity related to resource extraction. If you look closely, you can see things like roads. I see well sites for exploration purposes. I see well pads with equipment on them. I see forest harvest areas. I see pipelines, and then I see seismic lines of lots of ages and vintages. So all of this we call human footprint. These are the physical disturbances that are visible to the naked eye. And I would suggest that this landscape is fairly representative of what you find throughout the in situ region of Alberta. And the issue here is that all of this physical footprint has functional effects on the ecosystem. Probably the most widely publicized of these effects is woodland caribou. So human footprint features like the one in Kirby here open up the landscape to other primary prey species like deer, which in turn boosts predator numbers, and this sort of apparent competition is contributing to the decline of woodland caribou populations throughout northern Alberta. But it's not just caribou. So a few years ago, Fisher and Burton published this paper showing that this type of oil sands landscapes have shifted the entire mammalian communities in the region, creating winners like deer and lynx and losers like black bears, fox, and of course, caribou. There was another paper in 2019 by Lisa Mahan and colleagues, including BERA PI Aaron Bain, that showed the same kind of thing happening with bird communities. And all of this is complicated even further by the fact that it's not just wildlife we need to be concerned with. BERA co-PI Maria Strack has been instrumental in showing that in situ industrial disturbances also alter carbon dynamics in the boreal forest. And this is concerning because peatlands in Alberta represent this huge natural store of soil carbon that we want to keep in the ground. So in BERA, we have this guiding question: when is human footprint in the boreal forest no longer footprint? Now, this seems like a really simple question, but it's actually extraordinarily complex, because really what you're asking is, when is footprint restored? And what you have to recognize is that footprint is a physical thing, and restoration refers to functional things. So any given restoration treatment designed to reduce footprint could have multiple functional responses, some positive and some negative. So for example, we could be applying silvicultural treatments like mounding to improve tree recruitment, and it might have unintended consequences on things like hydrology and soil or carbon sequestration. So the whole thing is super complicated. If you want to restore footprint, you need to look at things through the lens of particular management goals. And the approach we take in BERA is that we use our multi-sectoral research partnership to inform our goals. So the current priorities that we're dealing with are promoting return to forest cover in disturbed areas, restoring natural carbon dynamics in disturbed peatlands, enhancing caribou habitat, and then maintaining habitat for other wildlife species. So functionally, BERA works as a multi-sectoral partnership. The current phase, like Julia said, is funded by a range of people. We have an alliance grant from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. We have private sector companies, ALPAC, Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, and Imperial. We have a not-for-profit organization, Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, and we have a public sector division, the Canadian Forest Services Northern Forestry Center. So all this together, equals what we're trying to accomplish here in BERA. We have a PI committee, all of whom you'll get a chance to meet today. I'll just introduce them real quickly. Scott Nielsen from the University of Alberta heads our vegetation theme. Maria Strack from the University of Waterloo heads our soils and ecohydrology theme. Aaron Bain from the University of Alberta takes care of the human and wildlife theme. I do remote sensing, and Julia, who you've already met, is our science coordinator. Then we have this advisory committee, which is made up of representatives from this multi-sectoral partnership we've put together. Robert Albrecht is from ConocoPhillips, Michael Cody from Synovus, Delson Zeus from Alpac, Ted Johnson from Synovus, Jehan Carrier from ABMI, Laurie Neufeld from Imperial, Amit Saxena from CNRL, and then Matthew Wheatley from Natural Resources Canada. I think most of those folks are here, but it's hard to tell in this big sea of faces. Okay, so here's the program at a glance. I've made a few alterations from what was distributed, but nothing really meaningful. I see we're already ahead of schedule, which is good news because I'm pretty much done the welcome and introduction to BERA. We're going to move next into describing BERA 2 research activities and deliverables. But I'm first going to talk quickly about the achievements from BERA 1, and then we're going to turn it over to the other PIs to lead us through these various themes. So Scott's going to deal with vegetation, Maria's going to do soils and hydrology, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to run it straight through. I think we're going to drop in a break there at some point. I believe it's probably right after Scott, but we'll let Julia make that call. Okay. Oh yeah, and then after that, we're going to have this, maybe more interactive round of feedback and discussion. So I don't know, Julia, have you given any thought as to how we want to handle interjections and questions? We didn't really discuss it formally before this.
Yeah, I think it would be easiest if we could try and hold off all of the questions. You could even start putting them in the chats if you don't want to. My preference would probably be that we come back to the roundtable in the last half an hour because the program is pretty full. If there's something super unclear, maybe raise your hand and put a chat to me. Maybe that's the way would be best. If it's just a clarification question, that's what I'm saying. Maybe we should only put those during the program and then everything else at 11:30, please.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so like I said, I want to start by describing the achievements of BERA 1 and discuss briefly how they set the stage for what we're going to do in BERA 2. So I like to think of BERA 1 as this project that addressed a pretty straightforward question, but it's got lots of facets. And that is, what tools can we use to understand and monitor the recovery of seismoclines and other disturbance features on the landscape? So today I'll give you a quick overview of the key outcomes of BERA 1 as they lay the foundation for the next 5 years, but it's really just going to be a brief glimpse. I'm going to let the research leads coming after me go into things in more depth as they see fit. Plus, I think that if you want more, there's a lot of material on our website. We held a workshop about a year ago, which summarized the findings from BERA 1. And so there's recordings and one-pager research summaries and lots of other things on there if you're looking for more details on these fronts. Now, as I go through these key outcomes, I'm going to use this little graphic here as a means of assisting my description. It's meant to show a timeline of an industrial disturbance like a seismocline that's recovering over time. Now, that recovery can take place naturally, or it can be assisted by active treatments like some of the ones shown here. So the first achievement really comes out of 5 years worth of work inside of BERA using various types of remote sensing. And all told, I would say that we found that LiDAR and optical remote sensing together provide the best foundation for monitoring and planning. They really are complementary data sets. And we would advise, continued use of both types of remote sensing. The second thing is that we developed a tool called the Forest Line Mapper. The Forest Line Mapper is a free open source software tool that accurately delineates and attributes any type of linear disturbance in the forest. And what it's meant to do is take an existing linear feature inventory, which I would suggest, really are primarily designed for cartographic purposes, and transform them into, a more powerful foundation for restoration, monitoring, and planning. We also did a lot of field work, as you might expect, investigating vegetation and soil responses to disturbance. One of the things we found is that wildfire promotes tree regeneration on linear features in both lowlands and uplands. We found that the average tree regeneration on burned lines was at least twice the rate of that on unburned lines, and that it's on both of those are higher than current restoration standards. So this suggests that in areas where it makes sense, a leave for natural approach to restoration is a valid strategy. We also looked at specific types of treatments and found that mounding promotes tree regeneration on seismic lines, but it can also affect abiotic conditions. We found that mounding alters soil properties and chemical properties in lowland sites, which may alter soil carbon dynamics and even affect the long-term prospects for tree establishment in some situations. These types of complexities to me really highlight the types of things you need to keep in mind when you're contemplating active restoration treatments like mounding, and it's something we're going to look into more in BERA 2. Back to remote sensing, our team spent a lot of time looking into whether or not we could detect and measure properties of evergreen seedlings on seismic lines using remote sensing. And what we found is that if we have leaf-off imagery in 5 centimeter pixels, we can detect establishment-aged evergreen seedlings. So these are the ones that are 8 to 10 years old and hopefully greater than 60 centimeters tall. We also did a lot of drone work and are pretty comfortable in describing the types of ways that drones can increase efficiency of boots on the ground field campaigns. So for example, work out of the Canadian Forest Service shows that we can use off-the-shelf drones to measure heights of seedlings on lines as small as 30 centimeters. Next, our wildlife team determined that acoustic recording units, or ARUs, can be used as this really powerful tool for monitoring wildlife and industrial noise in and around restored features. The same team is also showing that multi-source remote sensing data using things from the AVI, satellite imagery, LiDAR, drones provide the best foundation for bird occupancy and abundance models. And this is valuable because these types of habitat models provide a better understanding for the behavior of birds and other wildlife near energy footprints. Plus, I would say it also demonstrates that modern biologists like Aaron are really just remote sensing scientists in disguise. Last, and perhaps most synthetically, we use statistical models to predict tree abundance and growth on seismic lines across the whole Eastern oil sands region. And this outcome we see as providing government and industry with spatially explicit maps and models that we hope can assist restoration planning and perhaps identify areas that could benefit from active restoration. So, in general, when I think about all these BERA 1 outcomes, I would say that they kind of fall into 3 categories that set the stage for what we plan to do in BERA 2. So first of all, I would say our first major achievement is the development of all these practical tools for restoring, for restoration planning, I should say, and monitoring that can be deployed using readily available technologies. So these are things like growth and trajectory models, geospatial layers, software tools, and of course we want to do lots more of these types of things. I would say that this forest line mapper is really just the first in what we see as this forthcoming suite of BERA planning tools. And we really want to get into the habit of taking research outcomes and injecting them into practical planning tools like the FLM and other things like that. The second major achievement, I think, is this emerging understanding we're getting regarding the trade-offs surrounding specific restoration treatments. And I would say we need to know more about the consequences of various treatments and engage in a cost-benefit style analysis regarding active and passive approaches to restoration. The third thing is that we've developed this refined knowledge surrounding remote sensing platforms and technologies and their practical application for monitoring and planning. And of course, I include ARUs in this. So we see this ongoing technology assessment as really necessary for performing research and management at the scales that are going to be required here. Okay, so I just really blew through 5 years of research that was really carried out by, a whole host of undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, research technicians. So I want to take at least a second here to acknowledge them. More than 50 trainees, or as NSERC likes to call them, highly qualified personnel, came through Boreal, and I see this as one of our big achievements as well. Okay, so on to Boreal 2. What are we planning to do over the next 5 years? So in a nutshell, I would say we want to continue our efforts to build this suite of knowledge and planning tools that assess restoration efforts. So over the rest of the morning, we'll explain this more fully. And while doing so, I'm going to use this little scenario, and others are going to build on this. So imagine that we're in the forest looking down these two seismic lines. So from a restoration perspective, we want to know, are these lines there or not? And as I've explained, this is a complicated question because we first have to distinguish the physical footprint from the functional response. And a given line can have strong effects on some elements of the ecosystems and be negligible with respect to others. So we really need to look at a management perspective. So what are our goals here? So in Boreal, we use this term strategic management goals to define these objectives, and we have 4 of them. So first is we're interested in promoting a return to forest cover. Secondly, we're interested in restoring natural carbon dynamics. Third, we're interested in enhancing caribou habitat. And fourth, we're interested in maintaining the habitat for other wildlife species. So in order to achieve these goals, we have a choice between active and passive forms of restoration. Active involves specific treatments like mounding, planting, stem bending, the placement of coarse woody materials, whereas passive is really just a leave for natural strategy. So the challenge with this is that we're working in this extraordinarily complicated system. And we have to deal with all of these feedback loops between biotic and abiotic factors. And all of these things vary spatially. You can't just figure it out in one place and hope that it's going to work everywhere. And getting this wrong can lead to inconsistent results or unpredictable results. So we need to develop a deeper understanding of this system so that we can build predictive models, planning tools, and layers that will assist these restoration efforts. Now, we can't model everything in this system, so we have to be selected. So here's what we've selected. In Boreal terminology, we call these tactical deliverables. So, human use, growth and survival, abundance and height of seedlings and trees, animal use in and around seismic lines, carbon stocks, methane and carbon dioxide emissions in and around seismic lines. And if we're going to do this effectively, this is really a big sampling issue. So I know this is going to be perhaps difficult for you to see, but we have these strata that we intend to sample across. Ecosite type, fire history, adjacent stand structure, composition, terrain. I won't go through them all together. We have some matrix conditions, we have some issues related to linear disturbance, and we have issues related to treatments. So plus we need to do all of this work together. So these different system elements really represent the individual themes in Boreal. And so we need to have like the results of one theme interacting with the results of other themes so that we can put all these things together. Okay, so I'll take a minute. We do intend to do some work on some other types of features as well, but I think seismic lines is where we see our niche. What deliverables? Well, at the end of these 5 years, we're hoping to develop these models and geospatial layers and planning tools surrounding seedling abundance, height, growth, and survival, carbon stock, carbon dioxide emissions, and methane emissions. and then human use and animal use. What experimental strata? Strata related to the matrix conditions, strata related to the disturbance characteristics, and then strata related to the treatment strategies. The other thing I want to say is that there's lots of groups working in this space. And so we want to interact with these groups. And we see our niche in this geospatial tool development based on scientific understanding. Like I said, we're trying to build this, or the products or whatever that comes out of it, you know, gets built into these operational tools that we can pass on to managers and regulators. Related to that, though, I want to make the point that this is not an operational monitoring program. We intend to do things sort of on a proof of concept basis. So one of the other things we want to do is work with groups like ABMI and OSM to co-develop and operationalize these findings. So with that, I would say that, you know, we want to put a lot of emphasis on workshops and field trips and science communication and operational handbooks and things that will, you know, sort of take this knowledge and pass it on. Okay, so I'm quickly going to introduce you to this study area. There's a lot more in behind the scenes here, but I don't think it's particularly relevant for this group here today. This shows the BERA2 study area in relation to the OSM boundary. So you can see it's a pretty big area running from just north of Cold Lake to well north of Fort McMurray. It basically conforms to some of the OSM boundary, but there are some differences as well. Within here, we're going to do a fair amount of sampling at various scales and strategies. So first of all, we intend to establish these intensive sites, or super sites, I guess that you could say, some of which we've already got, others of which we're going to open up. We also want to run some transects. We don't know exactly how they're going to look yet, but we can envision, you know, flying remote sensing data, for example, along very long transects, which will give us an opportunity to extend some of our, you know, more detailed sampling beyond these super sites. And then, of course, we're going to have, and already do have, you know, this wide selection of extended or distributed sites, many of which we're going to revisit, and we're also going to, you know, establish new ones as needed. Okay, I know you can't see this, and that's okay. But I just want you to know that inside of BERA, we have this table of projects. So these are all of the research activities and key questions that we're hoping to ask and answer over the next 5 years. And you can see that they're organized by theme. So vegetation, soils and hydrology, human and wildlife, and remote sensing. And so essentially what I'm going to do now is step aside and let each of the other PIs step in and talk about these specific projects. And then you'll see me again towards the end when we talk about remote sensing. So I think I'm going to close my part here and stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Julia.
Thank you very much, Greg. A wonderful introduction to BERA and all the achievements.
How are we doing for time?
I think we're very good.
All right.
Very well. So I think we can breathe here for a minute. So no, great. I would like to now, though, turn it over to this session where all of the PIs are now, like Greg said, show their highlights, you know, of BERA1 and talk about their prospective projects in BERA2. So Scott Nielsen of the vegetation team is up first. And yeah, I would welcome you to share your screen now, Scott. Thank you.
Can everyone see that?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So thanks. Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the vegetation work and again, kind of an overview of our accomplishments to date and the vision of how that fits together with the next phase. Not sure on my slide. So overall, I mean, Greg was showing some of the conceptual linkages and strategic variables and relationships to the things that we're interested in, specifically in my group and the vegetation, growth, survival, abundance, and height of vegetation, primarily the woody vegetation, trees, and large shrubs on seismic lines. And in phase 2, some of the different relationships to the other factors within the system, such as the herbivory, seed rain, seed predators, and things like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first give a general review of phase 1. Some of that Greg already went over, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. And then talk about the phase 2. So these are set up as a series of papers or studies here. The first one here I'm going to talk about is from the postdoc Carolyn Franklin, where we looked at the geometry of seismic lines and its effects on microclimate, light, and tree regeneration. This was a little bit more of a smaller study in that 24 seismic lines were essentially split into replicates of 6 on either wide or narrow, in either east, west, or north-south orientation. And measurements of light, temperature, humidity, and tree regeneration were measured in the middle of the seismic lines, at the edges of the seismic lines, and into the forest out to 25 meters in each direction. And on the right side here are some of the key results for an example of the east-west oriented seismic line. Light on top here, this gray zone up here were larger openings such as exploratory well pads, the amount of light typical for those conditions. In the forest, obviously light levels are quite a bit lower, and you do see these different patterns. Of course, there's going to be more light on the line, but the effect size relative to how much it differs from either the forest or the reference opening was kind of a standing question. And to what degree did the patterns of light be affected by the orientation of the edge of the forest? So for instance, the north facing edge forest, in this case on east-west lines, typically receives quite a bit more light than the south facing edge. And down on the bottom here, on the bottom right on tree regeneration, you do see increases in tree regeneration in the seismic line, especially in the middle of the seismic lines, and in particular on the wider lines versus narrow lines, although that relationship for many of the differences in position aren't necessarily always significant, but because there's a lot of variation of sunlight within different, among the different lines. I guess I don't show it here, but if you plot the relationship between light and tree regeneration, you get a strong positive relationship as you'd expect. Secondly, seismic lines simplify microtopography in peatlands. So this has been suggested a number of times, but the effect size wasn't well known. That is, by how much does it simplify it? This was a study of 113 sites, so 226 plots, one in the forest, one in the line, and either burned or unburned sites, roughly about 50% burned and 50% unburned in the last 20 years. And a high precision altimeter was used to measure the microtopographic variation both across the seismic line and along the seismic line. I don't show the variability in terrain complexity, but seismic lines reduce terrain, the microtopography or the terrain complexity by about 20%. And it also depressed the forest floor an average of 8 centimeters. So this graph on the right illustrates both burnt and unburnt lines, which were the same, and then the burnt forest and unburnt forest paired plots. So the depression averaging roughly about 8 centimeters for both burned and unburned seismic lines. And this has an influence on certainly the microsites and regeneration. Mounding increases tree regeneration on most lines, so that given the lack of, or the reduction in microtopographic heterogeneity or that variability, as well as the hummocky nature, as well as the depression on seismic lines, Certainly one of the most common active restoration techniques, especially in peatlands, are mounding. And here this was a study with PhD student Angelo Filicetti, Michael Cody, myself, in the Kirby and Liddy areas with 127 seismic lines and adjacent forest plots. Tree establishment roughly was about 3 times higher on treated versus untreated lines, except for in poor fens where there was no effect of the treatment. Untreated lines had statistically the same number of trees as treated lines. And a really key finding also is that even untreated lines exceeded restoration standards and also exceeded the general planting rate of seedlings in the active restoration sites of about 1,300 seedlings per hectare. So there's a couple things going on here. First of all, the untreated lines had at least from the restoration standards, sufficient stocking of trees. Second of all, there was many more trees on the treated seismic line than even planted and could be accounted for between the planting and the untreated lines, which suggests that even the mounding itself is creating additional microsites that creates the opportunities for establishment of trees through natural regeneration as well. Line compaction rarely affects recovery in uplands. So this is a paper Angelo Filicetti and myself are submitting here hopefully this week. This is from 146 different sites times 2 plots in pairs, both on the seismic line and in the adjacent forest. Overall, there was pretty low compaction, like soil bulk density was generally below 1.5 grams per cubic centimeter. Which is usually below what is considered to be kind of compacted forest soils. High bulk density was not related to a reduction in tree regeneration and height, which is a key finding. So even across that bulk density gradient, generally there's no relationship with tree density. There's a really weak relationship in medium hydric sites, that pink line, but it's really represented by only a few outliers that are really driving that. Significance is pretty weak. And tree heights on the bottom, restoration standards suggest around 5-meter recovery. There's no relationship, a slight weak negative relationship in medium xeric, however, but that's largely driven by 2 observations on the end of the soil bulk density gradient. So in general, we kind of consider this to not really the bulk density and compaction in uplands certainly can occur in some places, but by far, if you take an average seismic line, it generally is not of concern. Fire doubles regeneration density on xeric forests and seismic lines. This is a study with, again, Angelo Filicetti and myself a couple of years back, 70 different sites, 140 plots in the McClellan Lake area, where there's quite a bit of jack pine forest on the Athabasca Sand Plain, as well as a gradient of different fire history, especially fire severity. And here, as mentioned before, as Greg had mentioned, tree regeneration generally on average is doubling on seismic lines as compared to adjacent forests. So even here in this figure on the right and B, you can see this was a lower fire severity site 5 years after fire. There's pretty much no seedlings in the forest post-fire, but there are not very high, but a substantial, significant effect in increase of seedlings on the seismic line post-fire. And of course, in very high severity places, as you'd expect with the serotinus, a species that's fire dependent for regeneration, everything is increasing in tree regeneration, and especially again on seismic lines, it's even more dense than in the forest. Fire also nearly doubles tree regeneration on mesic lines. So this is a paper in review with Angelo Filicetti and myself. 146 sites in upland mesic forest ecosites across a fire gradient. To the right is a figure of tree density, just broadly according to treatment type. So burnt line in red here, unburnt seismic line in blue, burnt forest and unburnt forest as the adjacent controls. Again, the recommended restoration standards of a stocking density of 1,000 stems per hectare is way down here. So we're getting a 20-fold increase in tree density on burnt lines and a 10 to 12-fold increase over the restoration standards on unburnt seismic lines in these mesic forests. So it again doesn't mean that there aren't some rare places that are very open. But again, if you take an average seismic line, many of these places have a lot more tree generation than most people would naturally consider. And to some respect, Angelo and I kind of believe there's probably a selection bias that goes on in quite a few studies on seismic lines and vegetation recovery. And the selection bias being, you first find really open seismic lines, and you can see them in remote sensing and so on. And then you study those open seismic lines, and your conclusion is they're very open with very few trees. So I think if you sample over a broader gradient of the landscape and you more randomize the location of your sampling or your research, some of those conclusions are probably a bit different. And down below, this is just looking at differences in species with tree density on seismic lines, the adjacent forest on all DBH classes, diameter breast height, and those that are sapling seedlings and so on, smaller trees. And of course, this being more mesic sites, it's mostly dominated by aspen, as you'd expect. Fire more than doubles tree generation in most peatlands. This is a study, Angelo Filicetti and I published this past year. And this study site is on 143 different sites in the treed peatlands, 286 plots because the adjacent forest plot as well as a control, across the different peatland ecosites and a fire gradient, that being recent fires within the past 22 years. So trees on average and burnt lines, more than 28,000 stems per hectare versus 11,000 on unburnt lines. And one key finding is over here in the lower right, burnt lines in red, unburnt lines in blue. These are all of the peatland, tree peatland ecosites. These are each of the individual ecosites: bog, poor fen, rich fen, poor mesic. It was the poor fen and the rich fen that really saw no differences with fire. So fire didn't necessarily dramatically increase tree regeneration on burnt seismic lines compared to unburnt seismic lines, but in all cases you will see, restoration standards of 1,000 stems per hectare are shown on the at the origin of the axis here on the bottom. So certainly there's more trees than needed if we use the provincial restoration standards and guidelines. Local conditions, however, do limit regeneration in peatlands in some sites. So we already knew this, but understanding the specifics of this and the effect sizes is pretty important. So again, using those same 143 different sites, Angela and I in that same paper looked at what specific factors are affecting local limits in tree regeneration. So there's quite a few things. So that paper has a large number of factors and their interactions and nonlinear responses and so on, but I'll just show two here as key examples. And the first is the trade-off between line width and fire severity in that middle diagram on the bottom. So darker green represents greater stems per 100 meters square. So if you wanted to convert that to stems per hectare, you'd multiply by additional 100. So here in treed bogs, at least, increases in line width and fire severity tend to create conditions that increase tree regeneration post-fire. And on the right side and lower right, I've already spoken about the effect of the line depression and the change in microtopography. But if the biggest concern there is when those depressions occur and those sites are wet, which tends to happen in more of the peatland sites, then you can get conditions of high water tables, which restrict microsites and establishment opportunities for trees. So here in this trade-off, you'll see the drier to wetter conditions on the compound topographic wetness index, the terrain wetness index, and the depression depth of that seismic line measured with that altimeter, high precision altimeter. And what you see here is the greater increase in tree regeneration in dark green where it's drier and has higher, that you don't have the depression depth on the seismic line. So the y-axis here is a little bit confusing, but a positive number actually means it's more depressed on average, and a more negative number is that the seismic line tends to actually be a little bit higher than the adjacent forest. And certainly those conditions at those specific sites tend to be very favorable for tree regeneration. Now, recovery rates by ecosite, this is the phase of kind of trying to bring together all the different ecosites and look at growth and trajectories across age of seismic line. So here, this is a paper Angelo Filicetti, Federico Riva, and myself are preparing right now. And here, this is taking all the ecosites or all of the samples that had both tree regeneration estimates as well as growth estimates of height-age relationships. So here, age is related to the oldest tree on the seismic line as through the dendro of cookies on the base of the tree. So that resulted in 375 sites where we had both information of age, height, growth, and tree regeneration density. On the bottom left is the diagram of those locations, broadly speaking to lowland, mesic upland, and xeric upland sites. So here, across age, regeneration density doesn't change really that much in the first 20 years. There were some sites that we had as old as 33, 35 years, but for the most part, most of the seismic lines we went to had a minimum age of around 20, 22, 23 years, 20 years for sure. So we've modeled things out to 20 years, which we feel we're pretty confident in. The graph on the right shows that relationship between stem density and age of seismic line, or the age of recovery since trees started growing, is what I really should say, by ecosite and by either burned or unburned. So in most cases, as you'd expect from those prior slides, burn conditions are going to often increase and sometimes dramatically increase regeneration density. Note the y-axis is in log 10 scale. As an example, poor xeric, which represents jack pine forest, is in red. The dashed line on the bottom is the regeneration density in unburned seismic line as a function of age, of minimum age of that seismic line. And the dark red is the burned condition across time since fire. But also, perhaps more importantly, because we kind of already knew that some of those relationships with fire, here are those same plots, but with 1,716 trees aged at the base of each of the individual trees. So there are multiple trees selected on each site, minimum of 2 trees per species per site of target species of roughly about 9 different species overall. Other sections, cookies were taken at different heights of the tree, but I'm only showing here the base age and the total height of that tree. That was used to model recovery or trajectory curves by ecosite and by either burned or unburned. So here again on the x-axis we have time, so age in years of minimum age of disturbance from seismic line based on the oldest tree on the seismic line, the height of that tree that was sampled, and that age with some log linear models were used to estimate. The reason the log linear models were used is because the first 20 years we did not see attenuation and growth of trees. The first 20 years trees were still growing essentially at a basic logarithmic function. Eventually there'd be a growth type model where you'd see an attenuation and a plateau of that relationship between age and height. But here under that log linear models, you'll see these relationships. A key thing is the 5-meter height has been suggested by the province's recovery rules. The other thing to note is poor hydric, medium hydric, and rich hydric sites average only 7 to 8 meter mature canopy heights, which means, that'd be like 65, 70%, 75%. 5 meters would be almost getting to the same heights as the mature adjacent stand. And certainly those type of ecosites here are the ones that are growing much slower, but they're still seeing a recovery. So this is all, again, passive recovery without treatments. In the 5-meter height, you're seeing many of the ecosites reaching the 5-meter height within 20 years, suggesting again that many of the sites do have potential for recovery through passive forms of restoration, which the beauty of that is it doesn't cost anything but time. The other way of looking at this is Angelo has put together the 9 different ecosites. Here's also some of the dominant species and some of those ecosites, and the time to recover based on either burned or unburned condition. So the x-axis is again recovery time as age or in years. The y-axis in this case over here is the height thresholds. So how long does it take to reach 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter, 4 meter, or 5 meter heights? And I should note that every single ecosite reached the minimum 1,000 stems per hectare threshold of the restoration standards. So you don't really have to even worry about that. The only thing then you have to worry about on an average seismic line is how fast it's growing and recovering. There certainly are, again, some sites that are problematic, but average sites definitely have substantial recovery relationships. So for example, like the poor xeric again has the strongest difference between burned and unburned as you'd expect. Here are the unburned conditions, 1 meter, you're 14 years, but after burned 5 or 6, 7 years, you could reach 1 meter height. And for let's say the 5 meter height, the restoration standards, following fire, you can reach that in about 13 years. But it does take over 20 years to reach that height without fire. So all these stars represent places that exceed 20 years to reach those height thresholds. You'll notice many of the ecosites do have quite a bit of potential for some of these trajectories. So a lot of this work we're also putting into spatial models, which I'm not showing here, to make those predictions across the area. So lastly, the phase 2 is really moving on from this work and looking at 3 different projects, the cost-benefit relationship. So again, I'm showing there's an awful lot of opportunities for passive restoration, which again costs nothing but time. And the active restoration is expensive and takes time. So finding the places that really need it and also looking at that cost-benefit relationship is in my mind pretty crucial. The second is state and transition modeling of trajectories, climate change, and other factors. And the third, establishment and herbivory. So especially that establishment and herbivory, much of that is shown in this diagram relating to conifer seed rain, deciduous regeneration through resprouting, herbivory, seed predators, the seed rain and seed establishment on these different microsites. And of course, there's different things going on, such as competition and other factors across these different strata. So just quickly on each of these projects, project 1 on the cost benefit analysis of active to passive restoration strategies. So kind of like I showed the difference between the unburned seismic line and burned seismic lines, those change the trajectory, the growth trajectory of these of the vegetation on those lines of those trees. So here again, this is just the example for black spruce. Black spruce based on years since establishment with this type of trajectory. The assumption is that active restoration treatments would speed that recovery. If it doesn't speed the recovery, then it's completely useless to do treatments and mounding and so on. But as we know, mounding is generally going to increase the availability of microsites and growing conditions for trees, and that increased growth is going to slide this line down. Using different height thresholds, you can determine the effects or the benefits in years, and years to dollars based on the cost of the restoration. So this will be a future PhD student in my lab. The second question is the state and transition models, bringing in fire projections, climate change, and different management actions. So just as a conceptual example here, we can have different essentially transition probabilities based on site conditions, based on species or composition or forest structure and other conditions, and use different software to simulate what we expect those transition probabilities to be. and or what the predicted outcomes of interest would be, such as the heights and densities and so on. But most importantly, this done through different scenarios. So the scenarios would relate to what will be the possible effects of climate change, and how climate change could be affecting a few different things, such as fire regimes. We know the fire, as those prior studies, are very important in speeding recovery. And well, I guess it destroys some recovery, but it also speeds the recovery post fire. You know, the boreal forest is certainly fire adapted, and so it's no surprise that tree regeneration does well after fire in the boreal landscape, especially in places that have some forms of stagnation. And then the last PhD project in my lab is going to look at this relationship between seed rain, seed predators, establishment, and herbivory, and how it limits recruitment and growth in some places, to basically look at these linkages as described here in this diagram. The final piece of work is what's referred to as the integrative work, or across teams. This is being done in kind of two phases, with really three phases, but the two phases on the integrative work are in the initial years to develop conceptual models and gap analysis of missing parameters and relationship between the different research programs, to make sure all these different arrows and linkages we either have information for, or we can identify gaps to try to fill those gaps, which is really phase 2 on different research projects. And the phase 3 at the end of the program is this integrative ecosystem model that considers the information to date, the studies, and tries to develop this more of an ecosystem systems model predictions. So just, you know, how does this all work and address management need? Well, fire recovers most ecosites except fens if you can wait. Mounding and peatlands recruits trees, but not in poor fens. Many ecosites have good natural regeneration. As I've shown, growth trajectories in most ecosites, many ecosites hits 5 meters in 20 years. And certainly certain site conditions restrict recovery. And there's some projects that are being identified here to kind of fill this, as well as highly emphasize the need for really looking at this cost-benefit relationship and the integration of a research program. So lastly, just the vegetation team. The 9 different members here. Angelo Filicetti was the main PhD project, full-time on this project, with 2 postdoctoral fellows who had a short period on the project, and the rest of the individuals listed here are working on other projects, but they had some linkages with the BIRA, or were master's forestry students or others that were brought on to do small short theses or reports on projects. Those underlined here, those are those that I described in some way today. I didn't have time to go into all the different projects in the vegetation. So I'll end it there, and I don't know, I guess I probably went right to the, or is there time for a couple minutes of questions?
Yes,
Julia,
so
I left 4 minutes or so.
absolutely, Scott. Thank you so much for this wealth of information that you've been able to provide to us here, especially on all the accomplishments your team has managed to do in BERA 1. Thank you. I would like to propose that we are well ahead of schedule. I think we're now getting so well versed at BERA, you know, we're very good at the schedule. So I would actually like to propose that we break here for 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, and allow some questions here. I have in the chat already 3 questions. I don't know if we can get, you know, to all of them, but Scott, if you're okay with that, can I pass those 3 questions to you?
Yeah, sure. I think Angelo's here too, so we can both respond. But what I'm presenting, I can't see the questions. So
no, I will tell you. So the first question was from Matthew Piper from Fuse Consulting. And Matthew, I think we have enough time. You can just ask your question, please, directly.
Yeah.
All right. Morning, Scott. So I thought it was really interesting, your comment and observation about the random sampling and how that's maybe creating a different picture of how much recovery there is. So I was curious whether you think there is also maybe a proximity effect of the seismic lines. So essentially lines closer to operations may be more likely to have been cleared and re-cleared during operations, and potentially have different levels of recovery than maybe a random sample might indicate. So I'm just kind of curious whether whether your data would be able to look at that, or whether you have thoughts on that, because from an operational implementation perspective, it would be kind of neat to map that out.
Yeah, I guess I could say two things, and Angelo can follow up. The first is an older study. Kesse van Rensen, who was a master's student in my lab, did find a relationship between distance to road and a log linear, log 10 kind of relationship. So very close to infrastructure and roads, there is an effect, but that effect diminishes quite rapidly with distance. And Angelo can correct me, but I think we did do a little bit of exploration on his, and it wasn't a strong effect, as strong as we thought it was. I mean, there was some weak effects seen, but very, very minor. They're not really reported here. Certainly you get really, really close, you can get those kind of scenarios. I should mention, I guess we have a bias, and we have a geographic bias in that Angelo, you know, he went out about as far as 4 kilometers or so for some sites, but most of the sites are probably 1 to 2 kilometers from a road. And to me, the bigger issue is, you know, like a lot of the treatment effects, you know, if you're looking at natural recovery, we see there's opportunities for natural recovery on most ecosites. Some ecosites still have some problems, but it just, to me, just reinforces that controlling human activity on the lines would be a lot simpler than doing these very expensive restoration treatments. And so, you know, certainly where there's a lot of vegetation disturbance or people are using ATVs and redisturbing them for roads and exploration or snowmobiles and stuff like that is problematic. But Angelo, you want to respond further on some of those observations?
I think just pretty much anywhere where there's people meeting or congregating or easier for them to get to, there's generally more likely to be using the line.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of lines I had to skip over because you can see they were just heavily used if it's close to a road, close to a park, close to a town, and so on.
Okay, so yeah, in that case, if it was right next to the town or the exploration activity, he was actually skipping that. So in one way, there's going to be a localized side effect where obviously those places that are redisturbed are kind of like we were saying, like if you look and find very open lines and you study those, they're going to be very open, right? So you know, a remote sensing project would be really good to look at that, probably better than, even though Angelo probably has, you know, 400 or 500 sites total, it still is only a small sample of all seismic lines, right? So, you know, ideally LiDAR data sets in a broader sample of the entire area would probably get at that. And at least Cassidy Van Rensen's answer to that was, you know, you could see a signal, but it diminishes pretty quickly with distance.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Matthew, for your question. I do have 2 other questions that have been raised, and I want to take the time that we address those. Melanie Dickey from the Caribou, the RIG collaboration, has a question about, the observation regarding fires and the implications to restoration planning. Melanie, please go ahead and ask your question to Scott.
Sure, thanks, Julia. And as your presentation went on, Scott, it kind of morphed into something a bit bigger than just fires. First, thank you for giving that overview. It was super interesting, and I really look forward to the new paper that you're talking about coming out. What I took home from your presentation in a very simplified way is that most of the seismic lines out there are actually regenerating above restoration standards already. Burns double the regeneration, and sampling is probably biased to make it seem worse than it is. Specifically, your figures showing the recovery rates over time suggested that most sites, though not all, would reach the 5-meter threshold that you talked about by 20 years. But we have a bunch of lines out there that are well over 20 years old and stagnated. So I'm wondering how you rectify that and what your main take homes are for caribou habitat restoration and prioritization.
Yeah. So yeah, a few things on the height trajectory. I think in uplands, I don't, you know, if you keep people off the lines, I think we're pretty confident that for the most part, there's very little, there's much less concern. So then it comes really to the peatlands and especially the fens, and things are much slower there. So it depends on your definition of recovery. We'd have to look, yeah, every single site. Well, Angela could correct me, but when we re-looked at the data, every single site had more trees than the standards. Whether those trees were high enough is a different matter. So then it comes down to, we have open lines. Well, what are open lines? Well, yeah, they're gonna be open, so the trees might not be as high as the adjacent forest. So then the question was, what height should they be? Well, if it's 5 meters, then yeah, we don't have a lot of fens at 5 meter height recovery for trees, but those fens only have 7 meter high forests. And if we look at the height of the trajectories out to 20 years, we are predicting, you know, between 1 and 3 meters is not uncommon. 3 meters is roughly half, 50% of the height of the adjacent forest. So I think of it this way, in 20 years, you can probably get half the recovery of the adjacent height of the forest, which to me is still pretty good. But you know, that's still an average. So there's certainly problematic sites out there. And obviously newer sites are, you know, are obviously going to show that they're very open. But if you gave them time, maybe not. And there may be some sites that, you know, with way too much, what am I trying to think of? Grinding up the trees, the whatever the, you know, the mulching and stuff like that could get way too thick and stuff like this. So I think there is that. And I think we've identified that, you know, especially that depression and wetness combination is problematic on that. And those recovery trajectories are way slower on fens and stuff like that, but I think that'd be expected. So I think it comes back to what is the definition of success in recovery? If it's to the adjacent height of the forest, that's a very long time frame, and maybe fires are even more beneficial because it resets everything. But, you know, and then the question is, you know, things like a 5 meter height rule, you know, how much of it is an ecological restoration versus functional restoration? And the ecological restoration is, you know, should that even be 5 meters, and should it vary between, because for us, the density thing, there's plenty of trees out there at least at the standards that are recommended, which suggests either the standards need to change on stocking density or not. But the from the height perspective, you know, one rule kind of thing at 5 meters across all ecosites is probably a little problematic in our mind. Some opportunities for flexibility there, I think, would be very much welcomed, and acknowledging like a treed fen has very short trees to begin with. And then on the functional side, well, like your work, Melanie, is, well, what does it take to slow wolf movement and reduce, you know, the effects on caribou and things like that? Well, relating back to, you know, you have the LiDAR heights and things like this, and you know, in some instances, you were showing very low LiDAR heights of whatever 0.6 or 0.8 meter height, and started slowing, but not at 4.1 meters, it further slowed wolf movement and stuff like that. So, you know, this is the problem, it's the eye of the beholder. It kind of depends on which species and what definition you use for recovery, because for every species it would be different. And it's an issue, right? And so at the end of the day, it's, you know, again, kind of this cost benefit, try to find the places that really need it, and really focus on that rather than broad scale application of restoration treatments.
Okay, thank you, Scott. There's a lot of discussions on the charts. Some of those things maybe you can, you know, as we later break, look at and maybe respond to as needed or as you can. There is, I think, time for 1 or 2 more questions though. Lionel asked the question. He wants to know the choice of, well, Lionel, say it yourself. I cannot pronounce these tools.
Learning about different simulation models, and so I noticed you used a package called ST-SIM. One that I'm more familiar with is Landis, and there's a forest succession model in that. I was wondering about relative advantages and disadvantages of each. If that's kind of, if that would take a long time to explain, perhaps it would be better left for an email.
Well, I could just respond real quickly. That's just what I put up there. I'm in no, I'm not saying I use that or I'm saying we will use that. I'm saying that's an example. That's all. So
Okay.
yeah, Landis and a couple of just some state transition model. And as just an example, I'd let the PhD student choose the advantages and disadvantage, but that was just meant to be as a quick example. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I'm gonna pull out one more question here. Again, like there's a lot of questions. Thank you all, and we'll see if maybe Scott can respond to them as things go on. But Marc-André Parisien has a question, Scott, about region specificity of your observations. Are they, or Marc-André, are you there? Would you like to ask it yourself?
Sure. So Scott, wondering, yeah, if some of your observations would be quite region specific. I see someone also asked a question regarding deciduous and conifers, kind of along those lines. So would you expect different dynamics in areas where you have greater moisture stress and a more important or aggressive, graminoid cover post-disturbance?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. So especially, that's the fen sites that really get that loss of hummock nature is, you tend to shift more into that sedge dominated site, which those especially problematic sites that are really stuck in arrested succession, I would say, and can be problematic. And so identifying those specific places, I mean, so don't get me wrong there. I'm not saying there are no places that aren't coming back, but and there are those type of places that are problematic. And the site specificity or the differences geographically and stuff. So that's, for the most part, that's why we've kind of had to, in the end, Angelo stayed with more of an ecosite based approach to individual models per ecosite. So if that wasn't clear, we first did papers per ecosite, and then at the final synthesis one on trajectories, the models are specific to ecosites because each ecosite has a different trajectory or response function. And and that's very dramatic. And it was easier to divide up the ecosites than create, let's say, an ecosite variable in a model with a 2 or 3 way interaction on all other variables, because the effects of other covariates were so different between ecosites. It would have required, honestly would have required 3 way interaction models, which are probably just too difficult to really work with. So absolutely, there's massive differences between ecosites.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I wonder if anybody has, we could take, I think, 5 more minutes. Wondering if anybody has questions more related towards the upcoming work as well, and also to what Greg presented earlier. I want to make sure, we're giving opportunity here for questions of all range for 5 more minutes. Anybody have other questions regarding the earlier material from Greg or on the BERA 2 projects that Scott has told us about? Okay, no questions. Then I would propose that we continue our program slightly altered. I would say we take a 5-minute break now, and then continue on with soils and hydrology. Just, this way we'll be maybe keeping our slight bit of a head time and have more question and answer period for all of the PIs here as well. So thank you again very much, Scott. Thank you, Greg, for this first session this morning. I would say we split now for 5 minutes. I'll keep all of this open, and then we reconvene and start with the soils and hydrology session. Hi, Michael. Are you here? I just saw you joining. I just want to let you know that we're a bit ahead of the schedule. So nice that you can join us now, but we're just a bit ahead of the schedule. And so we're just taking a 5-minute break earlier than planned.
Awesome. Okay, Julia, I'm assuming you're addressing me.
Yes, sorry, I meant you, Michael Cody.
All right,
Yes.
sorry. I just didn't have audio for a second there. Good.
Yeah. No, we already went through, just to let you know, we already went through the introductory material from Greg,
Okay.
and main accomplishments of Boreal 1. And Scott Nielsen just finished his vegetation team talk, which was on the Boreal 1 achievements and the Boreal 2 work. So sorry that you missed that, but I'm recording everything, and so I hope that you can revisit that section. It's very informative on all the vegetation trajectory stuff. Anyways, just thought I would let you know for a minute here. So we'll all be back in 2-3 minutes here.
And was there any reference, just out of sheer curiosity on my part, for the recent work that we reviewed with your new student on
No.
Growth response?
The growth response with
Based on FI's measurements? Yeah.
No, we're not.
Okay.
No, because we're putting that under Boreal to work. No, this is all
got it.
the vegetation team exclusive. All Angelo.
Understood.
Yeah, no, but it's a wealth of insights now that are coming together. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you in a few minutes.
Yeah, sounds good.
Hi, Maria.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm surprised that I think Greg was he's getting very professional at his introductions. So we're getting much ahead of our schedule here. He's getting well versed at Bera, I guess.
Oh, don't worry. You have Aaron Bain to slow you down. I'm
Good. See, that's how I'm glad we're sticking with the advanced schedule. Very good. Okay, we'll see here. Give it here 1 more minute for people to turn their cameras back on as a indication of you know, you being present again.
But I thought I'd at least show this so it looks okay, right, Julia? You can see
Yes,
my
it's
screen.
perfect.
Okay.
Perfect,
Perfect.
Maria.
It was
Okay.
more that I figured we'd take the time while people come back to make sure that's all good.
Absolutely. No, everybody's coming back now. That's great.
I'm not going to be able to live up to Scott's high standards of both reviewing Bara 1 and previewing Bara 2.
No.
I spent too much time on the introductory stuff, and so my second presentation is quite forward-looking.
Well, but you have to be congratulated. You're like well-versed at Bara now. Like this was probably your best yet. So smooth and streamlined and quick. I gave you way too much time.
Maybe too quick.
Yeah, hopefully if any questions come up in our last discussion round, they can be addressed. Good, well, welcome back after this little short break. So we are breaking a little bit out of our agenda, but I do think it's worthwhile to get ahead in the schedule and get these presentations in so that more questions can be asked at the end. So Maria Strack is a co-PI on Bara 2, working on the soils and hydrology team, or leading the soils and hydrology team. And please go ahead, Maria, with your presentation.
Thanks, Julia. And I will probably also put us a little ahead of time, so we'll see how this goes. But I have an advantage in that I joined the Bara 1 project relatively late along, only in the last year or so of that program. So we have not as many outcomes to talk about. But before I start, I also wanted to introduce Scott Ketchison from Athabasca University. And so Scott, maybe you can just say hi, so you'll pop up to the top of people's screen there.
Yep, sure. Hi, everyone.
And so Scott will be working closely with me on this project as a collaborator, particularly on some of the hydrologic projects that I'll be talking about. And I'll highlight that when we get into talking about the Bara 2 objectives. So just to start, I also wanted to take a chance just to look into a little bit more detail on the main outcomes from Bara 1 related to soils largely, a little bit on hydrology. And so Greg already introduced this bullet point, or these 2 bullet points, when he was talking about the overall outcomes. And so I just want to provide you a bit of the background as to sort of how we came to these conclusions. And so the first one is that we know that seismic lines become compacted, and Scott did a good job of showing that, the depression that happens. But we also wanted to look at the effect of mounding and how that changed some of those soil properties. And this is some of the work of postdoc Scott Davidson, and then also Kimberly Kleinke, who's doing a master's kind of straddling Bara 1 and continuing into Bara 2. So one way that we can measure the compaction in a soil is looking at the bulk density. And we did a lot of our work in lowland soils where we know that there are problems with regeneration. So if you have a higher bulk density, that would indicate a more compacted soil. And so Scott measured across a series of treed fens, actually some of the same sites that Carolyn Franklin did her work on the microclimate on, and measured in the natural sites and then onto an unmounded line and a mounded line, looking at any kind of natural mounds that were there or the created mounds. And so what you can see is that we do see that increase in bulk density, even in the low-lying areas on the line. But then when we create the mounds, that bulk density increases even further. So this suggests that mounding enhances compaction further, probably because of that additional disturbance that you need to do to the soil, but also because it tends to bring up deeper peats that have already been compacted and potentially mixes in some mineral soil, which has a higher density. So those are some of the things we're now trying to understand better, how much of this is enhanced compaction versus changes in the soil structure or in the soil composition. But when we're creating these mounds, what we're actually trying to do is create those dry microsites. And so what we did was also measure the volumetric water content in those soils. And so in all cases, not surprisingly, those high areas, so in the darker gray here, always have a lower volumetric water content, which means they're a bit drier. But with Scott Davidson's work, we already started to see an indication that even though we've created these mounds and these drier microsites they tended to be wetter than the mounds in the adjacent reference site. And this is probably because of that increased density. So that denser soil is able to hold onto the water better and not drain as easily. And so potentially, even though we've created a high spot in the landscape, we maybe haven't made it that much drier in the soils that the roots are going to see. And so Kimberly Kleinke repeated this study in another area of the province and actually found that effect even more strongly, where here are her natural sites here, and the mound is the darker color again, but now on the right hand part of the pair. And so you can see that in all cases in these different areas, the mounds are, sure, they're drier than the low-lying areas, but they're much wetter, have a much higher volumetric water content than the natural mounds. So this, although we know from what Scott Nielsen presented, that the mounds are aiding the tree recovery, this could mean that the way we make these mounds isn't really doing the best job that it could, because they're still staying wetter. And these are some of the questions we want to answer in BERA 2. We also found that there could be some trade-offs when we do this mounding in terms of soil carbon storage in these sites. And so this is some of the further work that Scott Davidson did. And the first place I want to look at this is in a poor mesic site. So this is where we have really high organic, we have quite high organic content in the soil, but that organic layer is relatively thin. So if we start to lose that organic layer, we can see that really easily in our soil samples. And so what we can see if we look across both narrow and wide lines is that we have, close to 90% soil organic matter in the undisturbed areas. And then as we move on to the line, we have about a 30% drop in soil organic matter. So we know then that the creation of the lines, the initial disturbance, has reduced the amount of carbon, at least in that near surface soil. So these were all measurements kind of in the top 10 centimeters. And this is probably just due to the disturbance, aerating the soil better, leading to more decomposition. We know on some of the older, wider lines, they actually probably scraped and disturbed a lot of that surface material. But it also suggests that post initial disturbance, that organic material isn't reaccumulating, probably because of the different microclimatic conditions and the different plant communities that we have on the lines. Now it becomes more difficult to measure that loss of organic matter when you're in a peat system, because the entire profile, maybe for a meter or more, is really all organic material. So even if you've lost some organic material, when you go and measure the soil, you're still going to measure all organic material. But even so, we thought some evidence still of a small reduction in the organic matter content on the lines, even in a peatland site, and potentially that mounding might have reduced that just a little bit more. But because of this difficulty of sort of working in a completely organic system, looking at that change in carbon stock isn't really the best way to do it. And so what we did was we looked at some other indicators of the decomposition status of the peat. So how decomposed is that material that's there? And if it's more decomposed, that would suggest that we probably lost some of it. And so one way that we can do that is to look at the isotopic composition of the organic material, where we would tend to get heavier, or basically have the bars move up when there's been more decomposition that's happened in that soil. This should be the most evident for the carbon isotopic composition, but we should also expect to see it in the nitrogen. So as we go from the reference system to an unmounded line and then the mounded lines, we do see that sort of steady increase in the mass, or in that stable isotopic composition. And so this suggests that, first of all, the mounded lines have a more decomposed organic material on them. So that evidence that probably some of the material has been lost during that initial disturbance. And then the mounded lines, particularly the mounds themselves, are even heavier, suggesting they're even more decomposed. So this would indicate that mounding has potentially led to additional losses of carbon, again, because you're disturbing and aerating that soil as you create the mounds. But it may also have something to do with the mixing of the soil, and that's another thing that we want to study in more depth now in BERA 2. But what it does raise the question, and something that we will be following up as we think about costs and benefits of these treatments, is that potentially we have a trade-off in that we're disturbing the landscape to encourage tree regeneration, but at the same time, potentially losing additional carbon through enhanced decomposition. And the other thing that we've started now with Kim Kleinke's work, in which we'll be pushing on into BERA 2 when I talk about our BERA 2 objectives, is now understanding how the chemical conditions and the availability of nutrients might be changing as we disturb the soil. So we expect that if we have this enhanced decomposition, even if it's only for a small period of time after that mounding activity, that it would also make nutrients available. And that may benefit some species and all species potentially, or it may change the competitive dynamics between the species. And so one way that Kim has started to look at this is to, again, use those stable isotopes and look at the isotopic composition of the peat compared to the isotopic composition of the leaves of the various species. And so here I'm showing black spruce because that's the species we really are trying to get to grow on the line. And then a shrub that potentially could be a competitor. And what we can see is that the pattern of that relationship between what's in the peat and what's in the plant is very different between these two species. And this could indicate that they're accessing different pools of nutrients. The pattern we see for black spruce also suggests that it's sort of a more rapid cycling, potentially with less of mycorrhiza involved in this nitrogen uptake. And what's also interesting is that in this newly mounded site for the Labrador tea, it's sort of showing a different pattern than in the natural and in some of the older sites. And so what we now need to understand better is sort of, are these site-specific things that are happening at this site, maybe slightly different moisture conditions, or is it that a different pool of nutrients becomes available during the disturbance period that those shrubs are able to access better than the trees? And so these are questions that, again, we want to follow up in BERA 2, and as Kim continues to analyze some of the data she has, as she's sort of straddling BERA 1 and BERA 2. And so this, I hope, leads directly then into the research objectives that we have for BERA 2 for soils and hydrology. And again, Greg had kind of alluded to, he had like our nice kind of overarching conceptual diagram. And as we dig into the questions we have in soils, maybe it gets pretty complicated. But we know that we've seen those changes in some of the physical structure of the soil, and that it's potentially affecting how those soils are holding water. And this is important because the way that the soils are holding and transmitting water is going to affect the water availability for the trees, or maybe if there's too much water, that we're actually getting sort of saturated conditions that's hindering the tree growth. But it also affects the ability of the microbial community to decompose and process organic material. And that's going to affect how much carbon is stored in the soil, whether that carbon is being released to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane. And so it will affect the greenhouse gas balance. And it also has implications really for just the energy balance on the site, which will affect things like soil temperature. And that may have implications for the plant communities we see, as well as how water is moved and held on the sites, which could have implications not only for the microbial cycling, but also just water resources at the local, but maybe even at the ecosystem and catchment scales. And so those are all the types of things that we want to understand better in order to help populate those state and transition models and help us to make choices that take into account these wide variety of different ecosystem services. And so I'll just walk through our proposed projects one by one. And I think we will have some time if you have some questions after I'm done. So the first two projects actually will be in close collaboration with Scott Ketchison, and they really focus more on the hydrology. So the first project, we want to push forward what we saw with those changes in bulk density and moisture content to really understand how the soil properties, and particularly the way in which they hold and transmit water, are changing on the lines and following mounding treatments. And this project, we already have a student in place, Leah Wheeland, who will be at University of Calgary working closely with Scott Ketchison there. The second project will then be able to expand on our understandings that we get from looking at soil properties to actually understand how those changes in water storage and movement, but also differences in things like snow accumulation and ablation, differences in the light availability on the line are affecting the water and energy balance. And we hope to do this locally, but also we found a really highly qualified student, Miriam Barakeshi, who has a lot of experience in hydrologic modeling. And so as her project develops, we think we may also be able to look at how those changing water and energy balance aspects affect the plant communities, but also potentially stream flow at a catchment scale. The third focus of the project comes back to those chemistry questions that I talked a bit about. And so some of this is already ongoing work that Kim is doing. But we want to understand here how the reclamation treatments are affecting the soil properties, but in particular the nutrient pools and availability, and then link that into how it's affecting the plant communities we see, and in particular tree growth. So Kim has already worked on that, and we'll dig a bit further into that with some soil profiles that she's done. So moving away from just the surface soils to profiles that go to over 1.5 meters. Also looking at phosphorus, which I didn't show today. But we also have a second student, Jennifer Flesher, who's just started in January, who will link this more directly to the trees and the local conditions that enhance tree growth. So we saw that Angelo Filicetti in particular, and a lot of the results that Scott Nielsen presented have shown really nicely where we have a lot of tree recovery. But now we want to understand, are there specific local conditions like that we could potentially alter to improve the efficiency of these mounding treatments? So if we know that we need to mound a fen, for example, can we understand better how the height of the mound, the soil properties in the mound actually will lead to the best tree growth possible, so that we can actually start to make some recommendations as to what are the best mounding practices in this type of ecosite. And so that's what this project is trying to tackle. And the tactical deliverable that we actually are sort of targeting in this whole soils and hydrology section, or one of the big ones, is this restoration of natural carbon dynamics. And so the fourth project is directly looking at this. The student will look at how mounding affects carbon and greenhouse gas exchange, and how this varies between ecosites and mounding treatments. So looking at sort of some of the mounding that we're doing currently, as well as some so currently our mounding often sort of leads to the inversion of the soil, which often buries some of the vegetation that's already started to recover on the line. And we want to compare that to some mounding treatments that we're calling right now, at least upright mounding, where we're able to retain some of that vegetation. But largely, this is just a question that we don't know right now. We have not gone out and quantified directly how carbon and greenhouse gas exchange change when we mound a line. And so that's the goal of this project here, so that we can also include that in our decision making when we think about trade-offs and costs and benefits. And as Scott also talked about integrative projects, we are also obviously wanting to integrate all of these findings into these broader BERA goals. And so we also have an integrative project that aims to move towards incorporating these shifts in carbon and greenhouse gas exchange at the sort of BERA landscape scale. And this work will be done by postdoctoral fellows, and we've actually decided to split this into sort of 2 half postdocs that will be working half their time on the BERA project. And so the first part will investigate how plant functional trait compositions, things like leaf areas, nutrient acquisition strategies of the plant communities change on treated and untreated seismic lines, and whether we can use that as a proxy to estimate carbon exchange. And this is a project that will be led by Ellie Gowd, who started a little bit on this in 2020 and is currently on maternity leave. So we'll come back and work on this when she returns. And so in the meantime, we've engaged Scott Davidson, who is already part of the BEAR1 team, who has started to do some work and will work closely with the remote sensing team, but maybe lay a bit of the groundwork on starting to see if there's some ways that we could map these changes in plant functional trait composition. And if it is related to carbon exchange, then that could be a way forward into mapping carbon exchange at broader scales. And so just sort of to show this, like as a proof of concept, is what we're sort of hoping to do in this part, so that that can be carried forward by the remote sensing team as we go. Some of you who may have seen this presented at a lunchtime seminar, but these are some sort of preliminary results from Scott Davidson, just actually working first at the plot scale to look at how just using digital photographs and the greenness of the ecosystem might show us some of the changes that are going on these lines. And so these are just some of our plots on a line in a bog and a line in a fen, compared to an undisturbed site in the bog and undisturbed site in the fen, and then these greenness measurements that have come from these digital photographs showing different phenological patterns on and off the lines at these different sites. And so these may be ways, starting to get at how the function of the plant communities are changing, and potentially ways that we could monitor that at larger scales. And that shift in greenness is well correlated to the changing plant composition, which is just shown, the plant composition is just shown here, but also is well correlated to the productivity of the plant community. So what we're measuring here is actually the ability of the plant community to take up carbon. So it does suggest that sort of these relatively simple metrics of greenness might be able to be translated into carbon exchange, and may be a way forward to start mapping those things at broader scales. So that's really all I wanted to talk about. I have the project table here, which will probably be hard to read, but in sort of that just summarizes all of that together. And I don't know, Julie, I'll leave it up to you if you want to take any questions now or wait till after Aaron presents.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Maria. You definitely were not faster.
Okay.
But thank you. I think it was very, very well explained. Thank you so much. I do think we can take about 4 minutes of questions. So if anybody has a question for Maria, please speak up right now.
I see that Anna has a hand up, Anna Dabros.
Then please, Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this. I just have a question with regards to comparing mounted lines versus non-mounted. Presumably, when you're taking data on the mounted sites, you're doing it like on the mount. And I was just curious if you also focus on the area next to the mount, which is still on the seismic line, because I noticed when I was sampling plant composition, that like the area next to the mounts is very, very different from the mount itself. And I think it's also different from the untreated lines. And I was just wondering, like in terms of carbon and composition and soil, did you ever focus on that as well? And also when people walk between these mounts, like you step on the areas next to the mount more often than on the mount, because you don't want to trample the seedlings. So that may be like additional compaction. So just from noticing how different the area next to the mount is compared to the mount itself, I was just wondering if you measured carbon and soil properties and other factors as well.
Yeah, so definitely when they sampled, they tried to avoid areas that were clearly impacted by people walking, because that definitely in sites where there is a lot, where it's a heavily used research site, that definitely happens. In the graphs that I showed there, where they were sort of sampling the mounds and then the low-lying areas. So I'm not sure if you're asking about the areas that haven't been treated at all, but we were largely targeting, at least in those graphs I showed, the mounds that they created, and then the sort of low-lying area that was created from that mound. But in a lot of cases, not the bottom of that low-lying area, because those mounds are quite large. So it's kind of the low that's not completely buried underwater is what was sampled. But that, I think with the current work that Kim's doing, she's sampled more also in between the mounds, which I think is what you're saying. Like, so the areas that are not treated.
Yeah, I was curious if you were focusing on in between the mounds as well, because I think that area, it's definitely different from the mounds, of course, but I think it's also different from just any plot on untreated line. Because I think just creating the mounds affects that like the rest of the line, which is, it's on the mounded line, but it's not a mound. So.
Yeah, and I think there definitely is potential for additional compaction in between the mounds, even because the heavy equipment needs to pass another time.
Yeah.
As it makes the mounds.
Yeah, so I mean, it accumulates like these areas that are on the mounded sides, but are not the mound. So I was just curious, like if you are looking at those as well, because I mean, obviously like the responses in that area of the line will be different and will also impact regeneration of the line altogether.
Yeah, so
your students are looking at that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Maria. There's one more hand up from Michael Cody. Maybe we get quickly 1 or 2 more minutes in, and then we need to continue. All the other questions, maybe we can keep for now for the later session. Michael?
Yeah, 2 questions, I guess. Do we suspect that the increase in bulk density and water retention on the mound is less than optimal for tree growth? And then number 2, I guess, is it possible that we will improve carbon stocks through site preparation?
So yeah, I think, so we haven't looked at that yet, Michael. And so that's the first part of your question. Clearly from what Scott Nielsen presented, there's trees establishing on the mounds, right? So that would suggest, at least at some sites, it's not suboptimal, but it might be that in some situations, like where we didn't see that the mounding had a big effect on poor fens, this could potentially be helping us understand why that could be the case. Is that peat is more compactable, and that the mounds themselves are still quite wet for the trees. But that's what we're hoping, that some of the local scale work that Jennifer will do will help us to answer, try to figure out kind of what is the optimal moisture content for black spruce growth in these low-lying areas. And I mean, there's literature on that as well. In terms of your second question, I think that is a good point, right? That I should have maybe said in the short term a little bit more, in that we don't have really old mounded sites. So there is the potential. We know that, or we're quite confident that in the short term, the mounding releases carbon. But if we end up with, much better tree growth and a nice recovery of the understory, that maybe in the long term, we actually enhance carbon accumulation. So that's what we need to figure out. And that's sort of what some of the questions we'll be asking as we move forward in BERA 2.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, both of you. I would say I would prefer now to continue with our agenda. So we're staying on a nice pace here. I believe Erin is next. Yes? No! Yes, Erin Bain. Erin Bain with the Wildlife and Human team. Please, I'll welcome you to share your screen now.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. My name is Erin Bain. I'm a recovering biologist, aka remote sensor, according to Greg. But actually, what Greg did say does have quite a bit of relevance in terms of some of the projects that we'll be working on. So my role in BERA, I think, has long been, and in other programs in the oil sands, has been to understand the impacts of human disturbance on wildlife. So wildlife always are the response, I think, generally is what people have tended to make the focus. And that will continue to be true in BERA too. But At the same time, you know, as Scott has mentioned briefly, as well as Maria has talked a little bit about, this wildlife itself isn't just responding, but it's influencing the way that things recover, the way that humans use the landscape, the way that all of these things interact. So one of my, I think, visions for BERA 2 is to try and think about wildlife from the perspective of, you know, how are they being impacted and how are they being, you know, creating an effect in and of themselves. So my role is going to be really around collecting, you know, quite a bit more data, highly focused data, to address both of those types of questions. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, my presentation is a little bit different, and then I'm mixing together what we're going to do with what we've done and why. But one of the things that I also really think is important to emphasize going forward is this role of human use. I'm going to show some examples and talk about some examples where, you know, the response that we're getting might be vegetation, but it also might be people. And so understanding, you know, the relative importance of those two things is actually critically important in evaluating what our best choices are for mitigating some of the effects of oil sands development in the Boreal. So, again, now there obviously are, you know, thousands of species for which we could use as indicators of various things. And, you know, my goal is to help and facilitate working with other groups and parties to be able to bring together some of the data sets and some of the information that we can use to make, you know, to use a variety of indicators. As Scott put it, I think very eloquently, you know, recovery is in the eye of the beholder. What's recovered to a bird is not necessarily recovered to a caribou, not necessarily recovered to a small mammal, not necessarily recovered from the perspective of invasive species. So the point being, you know, I think we have to start using that kind of information to setting, you know, some targets based on, you know, a variety of indicators, so that we're not just relying on things like tree heights of 5 meters, because honestly, tree heights of 5 meters don't necessarily make a landscape recovered for many species, as a very simple example. So again, you know, the focus for me is a little bit some more methods, better data, and I think then the third most important part is then how do we use these new tools to help us understand the role wildlife plays in the recovery process itself. So my first project is going to be on wildlife and linear feature responses. So there's a lot packed into this one slide, and I'll go through it. So the first question is, you know, why do we need to know more about cumulative effects and thresholds on wildlife? Don't we have a lot of data already? And I have shown, you know, through a variety of, you know, presentations and talks, we have this Boreal avian modeling project, which has put together about 30,000 point counts in the oil sands region of Alberta. We have the oil sands monitoring, which is continuing monitoring using recording technologies like ARUs, just like I do. We have Environment and Climate Change Canada doing similar things, and we have ABMI. And in all cases, that data is very valuable for a variety of things. I mean, the most fundamental of which is it's going to help us with change over time, looking at how systems are reacting. And it also very much helps us with estimation of things like population size. How are populations being affected by our development activities? And when you use an ARU, which is up in the top right corner, and for those of you who don't know, an ARU is one of my remote sensing tools, as Greg puts it, and it's a sound recording device that just records everything that it hears. And so it can be used to count anything that makes a sound. But when we use those in these, you know, oil sands monitoring, BAM type of perspectives, what we are tending to estimate is density. So it's the number of animals that we can hear on those recordings. And we use that to create what I would call course level, you know, human interaction, course level cumulative effects models. And they allow us to partition and understand, and I'll show some examples of what they're capable of, understanding how animals' density is being changed as the intensity or density of footprint goes up. So this image shows it really well. If you listen and you record only those animals that you hear, or you listen and you process the data for all of the animals you can hear in a typical single ARU out in the landscape, right, you can say, well, there's a pipeline in here, there's 10 seismic lines, there's a road, and, you know, statistically, I can kind of figure out the relative importance of each one of those activities. But the reality is, it doesn't address the question of how does recovery on those kinds of features influence things, because you have so many things going on at the same time in that single circle, that single sampling location. So the rationale of BERA 1 was to say, no, let's not collect that same kind of data. We have a lot of it. We can use it to assess, the impacts on density, population size of things that make sounds. So in Barrel 1, what we did was the opposite. We zoomed in. So we went to seismic lines and we measured using ARUs, but very precisely using a technology called sound triangulation, exactly where individual birds were singing. And I won't go into how this works, but sound triangulation in brief can get the position of a bird estimated to within a meter. The other methods, these OSM, BAM, ECC methods, all you can tell is they're in an area of around 150 to 200 meters away from the ARU. That's about the best that you can do. So we're talking about very different resolutions of data, and so your perception of the impact and the consequence changes from being one about density and cumulative effects to what is the effect of this seismic line on the behavior and the way this bird moves and the way this bird uses this particular piece of real estate. And we could show, looking across a gradient of seismic line recovery, that these birds were, seeing the landscape as recovered, albeit even at the most recovered seismic lines, there was still evidence that they avoided them to some degree. They were starting to use them as the vegetation regrew, but they weren't using them in proportion to their availability, for example. Now, the other thing that we found with using this very detailed method is that lines that had no vegetation on them, i.e. a lot of ATV use, were completely avoided. The birds were nowhere near them. And that leaves, I think, a very big and open question is it the lack of vegetation that the birds are reacting to, or could they be reacting to the actual physical disturbance of the quads and the cars and all of the other things, rather than it being the plants? So in BERA 2, I want to take a middle ground approach. And the reason being is that the sound triangulation approach, the maximum sample size a student is ever going to be able to achieve because of the degree of labor intensity involved is about, 50 to 60 sites over about 2 years. And so really you can't, you can learn a very detailed study, very precise, accurate answers, but it won't scale up. So in BERA 2, what we're intending to do is kind of go middle of the road. So the idea here is that when we are listening to sound, sound travels out at a set rate and it gets quieter. The recording gets quieter the further the animal is away. And in BERA 1, we were able to demonstrate that we can very accurately, not 1 meter accuracy, but 10 to 20 meter accuracy, determine where the birds are in relation to footprint features by using what's called sound amplitude. So what we're going to develop is this concept of the limited amplitude point count, which will take us from going, all right, I'm just counting everything I can hear out to the maximal distance that the sound travels versus down to 1 meter accuracy. We're going to go somewhere in between. And so the idea is, as what's being shown in this BERA 2 slide, is we plan to put ARUs on the middle of disturbance features with varying degrees of vegetation recovery, and then at varying distances away from the edge so that we can get much more refined edge estimates of the zone of impact that is occurring from different types of features. And PhD 1, who's Thurindu, who's going to be working on the project, he is going to be really emphasizing the role of linear feature width, the effect it has on edges, and whether or not the vegetation on the linear feature is influencing the magnitude of the edge effect. And so this, is going to work through the WildTracks platform. So those of you who don't know about WildTracks, it's a platform that I have been developing in conjunction with Environment and Climate Change Canada and ABMI to provide a centralized store for things like ARU data, as well as remote camera data. And I'll talk about this in a second, but also remote vegetation data that we're currently working on. And the idea is that we're going to develop the tool to be able to take this from just unlimited distance type point counts and to be able to integrate these various other types of approach to counting birds so that we can get much more refined zone of impact and vegetation recovery criteria by being able to go to a lot more places, but still having that accuracy of measurement that we really need to answer the question. Now, the other thing I just said is that, we are working on a platform as well to take in the kind of images that Maria is talking about, where you take ground-based photographs. So at every ARU and every remote camera that's been deployed in Northern Alberta, there are ground-based images of, what does it look like up, down, east, west, north, south. Those are going to be in the next release of WildTracks integrated so that you can go in and use those to validate remote sensing, to see what the vegetation looks like. And if we can start to include these very detailed 1 meter squared kind of photographs, I think we have an opportunity to take, this to the next level in having tens of thousands of photographs collected by everybody on different vegetation, different linear features, different recovery trajectories, that we can actually start to collaborate by using those images for multiple purposes. Now, as I said in the last slide, the Canada warbler response from our previous work in Barrow 1, kind of leaves us with this question. Is it this kind of wide open seismic line like this with no plants on it that's the problem for Canada warblers? Or is it the fact that there's quads using this on some kind of regularity? And so this is one of the fundamental questions I would like to address in the student 2, which is wildlife-human interaction. So on the left here is a map of the United States, and this is actually a predictive noise map that was made by the US Park Service based on pretty brutal data, to be honest, but this has been used many times and has been shown to be very predictive of how wildlife react to various things. The level of noise in the landscape can have quite a bit of an influence, or at least it's a good predictor of where species tend to be. So Richard Headley is a postdoc who's currently in the lab collaborating with ABMI and oil sands monitoring. He's going to have a map, the preliminary first map, finished very soon for the oil sands region that maps out what does noise look like in the oil sands. And what we plan to do through BERA 2 is to refine that. So first off, we want to validate the model that we create. And the second thing we want to do is start to partition that noise down into various types and seasonalities through directed sampling. So I think we heard some statements earlier about, closer to town, lines are less recovered, closer to major parks, lines are less recovered. That's probably due to ATV usage. But the thing is, we have no clue how much ATV usage leads to a line like this. Is that 1 pass a week, 1 pass a month, 1 pass a year? We don't have a sniff. So what I think we're going to be trying to focus on is, trying to figure out how, much activity does it take to make a line not recover, essentially. As well, that kind of information is going to be super useful for understanding the mechanisms by which the species, whether they be birds, frogs, other things that make a sound, or the larger mammals through collaborations with groups like the RIC, how that influences the wildlife response. The other thing that I would emphasize is we're trying to automate this. So at the top panel here, this is an image of the Blackfoot Reserve east of Edmonton, where we put out ARUs during the hunting season. And we were able to automate the process of finding gunshots. And we can actually look at how people are using the landscape for hunting, which then could obviously be used for predictive in terms of where are people going and why, what are they doing there, and using that to also predict sort of the wildlife response. So this is going to be a combination of using ARUs, traffic counters, and remote cameras to try and collaborate, to try and estimate these things. And obviously, my role is primarily in the ARU side of things, but I am planning and hoping to collaborate with as many people with remote cameras as possible to be able to use those to actually track this human activity out in the landscape to create a much better map of noise and human use of the landscape. Now, the third project has kind of been a little bit of a shift. So Scott Nielsen's student is really going to focus on the role of herbivores and how they might be, influencing line or well pad recovery. So rather than my student, just do that, what we've decided is my student is going to focus on developing the methods to let Scott do that very effectively, cheaply, and and accurately. And so what we're going to do is kind of switch this third student to work on techniques as well as address the question of well pad recovery. So in Barrow 1, we studied well pads that have been certified reclaimed to look at how birds in particular are reacting. So this image on the left in aspen forest, it shows a well pad that started to have a lot of vegetation encroaching from the side versus this one, which is mostly an open grass with a line through it and not very much vegetation on it. And we were able to figure out, the patchiness using LiDAR and drone imagery, the kind of patchiness and tree growth patterns on a recovering pad that would lead to the bird community recovering. And we emphasized a bird called the ovenbird And what we were able to show is that, you know, they certainly were coming back and starting to use the well pad, but a lot of them also lived into the forest itself. And so the question is, you know, when does this well pad fully recover? And the answer was there were lots of species that would never come anywhere near even these ones. And so this gets into this question of, you know, what species are we going to use to set up thresholds for vegetation recovery targets for things like well pads as well. Now, I said this earlier, but the method that we used to do the ovenbird work was also the sound triangulation approach. And again, we got to a sample size of around 40 well pads. Simply isn't going to be enough to address, you know, the kind of questions that we have about linear feature width. It's not going to be enough to address all of the different habitat types out there, like pine and black spruce and aspen. So we need this more rapid way. So this, you know, limited amplitude point count approach is what we're planning to use. And I think that's going to be a game changer in that other people can participate by collecting data using ARUs that we'll be able to use, and we'll be able to get, you know, probably in the neighborhood of hundreds to thousands over the length of the Barra 2 project to be able to address many, many more species of wildlife going through. Now, the other thing that we're going to do is everyone has remote cameras, and I have been working with various groups like the RIC and others to try and integrate camera data into the WildTracks platform. My role of cameras is actually going to be to turn them around and use them in a totally different way. I don't care about caribou. Okay, I do care about caribou, but I don't really actually want to take pictures of caribou. I want to see if we can use remote cameras in a different design to help us understand small mammal response. So small mammals, we know from past work with trapping, which is again very labor intensive and invasive, that the wide linear features that are in a grassy state are dominated by this little cute guy here called the meadow vole. And once they start to recover, the community switches to redback voles. Deer mice are sort of an intermediate step. This is a really tight relationship. It's well known in forestry, it's well known in fire, it's well known in a lot of other situations. So I think they could be excellent indicators of, you know, when is a well pad recovering at the base level, right? And when is it starting to grow trees and shrubs that are in such a way that are beneficial to the base of the food chain? So we're going to be developing these techniques as well as automated recognition processes to be able to count small mammals rather than having to do trapping that is really, you know, just won't be time efficient to actually do it. We'll obviously be doing ARUs as well. And the last component I just want to highlight is, I think Michael Cody's raised this, and fairly so many, many, many times, is what we compare an animal's response to matters. So if I compare what an animal is going to do in a mature to old growth forest to a line that's only got trees 5 meters tall, of course they're still going to react to it. There's a 15-meter gap in the canopy. Of course birds are going to see that and still perceive it. So the question, I think, particularly for the well pad project is, when is a well pad more like some other kinds of disturbance? So when is it more like a cut block? When is it more like a fire? And so I have another grant that will be announced basically in the next couple of weeks, working with ALPAC and all the 4 other forestry companies in Alberta to study some of, you know, some very important questions about their practices. But we'll be able to use that as baseline data to compare well pad recovery for wildlife with that we're finding in cut blocks of similar ages and similar structures, as well as fires. So the last thing is the integrated part. And my goal, I think, is, and all that I've been striving to do for the last few years, is to try to bring all of these various programs together, that being ABMI, Environment and Climate Change Canada work, oil sands monitoring, and things like that. So I've played a role in the development of the modified oil sands monitoring protocol and design, which is called BATR, or before after dose response. I won't go into it in detail, but it uses very similar methodologies to what we're talking about in Barra, in that it uses ARUs and it uses cameras, but it is studying the concept of cumulative effects at large scales and trying to, you know, pull apart all of the various different pieces. And I would argue that Barra is super complementary in that way, in that what it will allow us to do is take these kind of coarser models and start to get in Greg's data on remote sensing, Aaron's data on human activity models, the zone of impact things, and that's going to change the level of reporting that we're capable of doing. So what I want to emphasize is where we're going is, you know, right now you can go on the ABMI website and you can get, you know, the magnitude of effects on any given species. This is ovenbird. This is the energy sector effect. And we can talk, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but this has been argued. Many have said that's not good enough. You're just telling me energy has an effect. I don't care. I want to know what are the sources. So what you'll see in the next upcoming set of models that are being reported on the ABMI's biodiversity browser is the individual disturbances caused by seismic lines, well pads, industrial facilities. And we can tell you, based on if we treat everything the same, i.e. all well pads are a well pad, all seismic lines are a seismic line, what the effects are. And that will be coming out relatively soon. But frankly, that's still not good enough. We know that Scott, Nielsen has proven quite conclusively that many lines are in a highly recovered state. And we've shown, from the work we've done in Barrow 1, that wildlife react differently to lines with different amounts of vegetation. So the generation 3 models that I foresee coming up on the ABMI biodiversity browser and other places like it, working with OSIM, is to bring all of this stuff together to make models that incorporate all of that increasing reality. So instead of it being seismic lines, it would be seismic lines that have reached a 2-meter height threshold, seismic lines that have reached a 10-meter, whatever those criteria end up and turn out to be. So with that, that is it for me, and I am happy to take questions if there's time, or we'll let Greg go.
Thank you very, very much, Aaron. A great presentation on what you're planning to do, very impressive. I think, just to be fair, I think I should give you at least 3-4 minutes. We are now caught up in our agenda. And Greg, I'm gonna not really eat into your time. I'm just taking 5 minutes from the end thing for Aaron to have his few minutes right post presentation. So anybody have a question for Aaron? Please raise your hand or a comment. Was all very clear. I think it was very clear. Anybody? Matthew, is that you?
Jump in.
Yes.
We can't let Aaron off too
yes.
easy. I'm curious about the methods that you're using to sample small mammals. Has that been used before, or is that something that you guys came up with?
It's never been used before, as far as I know, in Alberta. It's been used all over the world, and it works very successfully. The nice thing is you don't have to put a trap out. You don't have to be there the next day. You don't have to deal with the health issues and things like that. And people are finding very strong correlations between the camera data and and trapping data. It won't give us density probably because we're not marking and recapturing, but it will show us relative abundance and habitat use, which I think is probably, for the kind of work that I want to do, is what we need. So
It's not a question, but I just want to point out that Aaron's a remote sensor.
Point well made. Good. Well, then any other questions that come in your mind, hold on to them then please for our final discussion round. So now, Greg, I'm looking forward to hearing your remote sensing presentation. Please go ahead.
Hey, sorry, I wasn't quite prepared. Give me a second.
No problem.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk now about the remote sensing group's plans for BERA 2. I'm going to spend a little less time summarizing the work that took place in BERA 1, so I apologize for that. I'm not going to be as thorough as some of my colleagues have been, but hopefully there's still value in this. The other team members have been using this process diagram to sort of position where they intend to do their work. And I'd suggest that the remote sensing group operates a little bit differently than the others, because we're not really trying to understand the system per se. So it's not so much that I'm trying to figure out which arrows here, need to be investigated a little bit, but rather what we're here to do is to develop workflows, tools, and geospatial products that measure or characterize one element of the system or another. And I would suggest that this serves several purposes. first of all, if we can detect and or measure one of these tactical deliverables directly, then we can greatly facilitate the process of restoration planning and monitoring and reduce the need for fieldwork or predictive models. And I think we sort of heard that theme come up several times here this morning already, is that we might be a little bit limited as to what we can do boots on the ground. So if we're able to sort of expand our sampling horizon through remote sensing, then we, first of all, might learn new things. And secondly, we might ease the burden of these other predictive models. The second thing I would suggest is that if we can characterize the environmental factors that influence these tactical deliverables, or measure some of these elements that we want to stratify our work against, then we can really assist the modeling efforts of our BERA colleagues. So it might be adjacent forest things, it might be, features of the disturbances themselves, but we want to see which of these things that we can also characterize with remote sensing. And finally, there's going to be cases where system elements or tactical deliverables can't be sensed directly. And I'm of the opinion that we need to get more comfortable with models and response curves that are based on remote sensing analogs. So I think we're all familiar with these sort of response curves like we see here in forest yield, for example, but they've got age on the x-axis. So we don't know the age all the time. So how are we going to do this on lines or disturbances whose age may not be known? So we've got a couple of alternatives. We can try and predict age, or maybe we need to learn to live with, other remote sensing analogs. So I would argue that this is something that we need to sort of get used to as we try and scale up over large extents like the lower Athabasca. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the projects that I have planned specifically. I apologize for these crappy looking tables, but I'm trying to refer back to the table of projects, especially for our partners who have been following along on how we're mapping things in the proposal to things that we're actually preparing to do. So this is mostly for their benefit. The first set of projects that I'm going to discuss here are aimed quite specifically at forest regeneration on lines. So this is the topic that I ended up splitting actually because of collaboration and support from the Canadian Forest Service. So in this case, I'm going to work with Guillermo Castilla to look at several research questions related to stocking assessment and tree growth on seismic lines. So we're sort of envisioning 3 master's students working somewhat together. One I'm calling the deep learning student, one I'm calling the seedling growth environmental student, and one I'm calling the seedling growth technical student. And I'll go through quickly what I'm intending to do with each of these 3. So first of all, we've sort of had this underlying question in BERA for a while now is, can we identify these seedlings on seismic lines? And quite early on in BERA 1, we showed that of course we can with remote sensing under the right conditions. So Corey Fedek showed several years ago that if you're real close with a drone, you can find the seedlings in here. You can do some, fancy image processing, and you can pull them out really quite accurately. But of course, we're not able to hover drones over ideal conditions all the time. So what we want to do next now is find ways to do this over really large areas. So we've worked on this topic already a little bit, and what we find is that kind of traditional classifiers, they work, they're fairly robust, but they can be tricked by things like shadows or background noise or other sort of environmental things that you might consider noise in the system. So what I would suggest is that we've sort of got a new tool here that we want to test, and this is in collaboration with not only Guillermo but also Matthias Schubert, who's here from Ludwig Maximilian University. We want to know, can deep learning, which is sort of the ultimate pattern detector, can we reliably detect evergreen seedlings for remote sensing imagery over large areas? So can it solve the problem of the background noise and the shadows and the things that might limit more traditional approaches? Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that we've already shown that this can be done with 5 centimeter data and greater than 60 centimeter seedlings. But now, like I say, we're trying to take that next step towards operationalizing it and testing over really a whole variety of conditions. The second project related to this conifer stalking thing is, what I'm calling the seedling growth environmental student. So previous research has shown that evergreen seedling height can be measured fairly accurately if we have sub-centimetric imagery in seedlings larger than about 30 centimeters. This is work coming out of Canadian Forest Service and Guillermo Castilla's lab. But I think we would both agree that this was a fairly limited pilot project and only incorporated a few plots. And secondly, we were only measuring height at a single date, rather than looking at growth through time using multi-date imagery. So we have a large number of seedlings out there that are already tagged and measured and were flown back in 2017. So what we want to do is remeasure those seedlings, refly those seedlings, and see if we can, sense their growth. So like I say, I'm envisioning 2 students kind of working together on this. One looking at the environmental factors that might affect our ability to do that, and one looking at the technical factors that might affect our ability to do that. So environmental factors are things like phenology and site type and species, and technical factors are more remote sensing things like pixel size, lighting conditions, and processing strategy. So that's, I would suggest, the sort of first little batch of projects that we're envisioning here for BERA 2. The second one, spectral recovery on, spectral recovery analysis, I'll call it. Again, this is related to sort of vegetation growth and trajectory on seismic lines and other disturbance features. And we're envisioning a single PhD student here doing some work on a topic that we've not discussed yet in the BERA context. And that's using long time series analysis of satellite remote sensing to see how vegetation is recovering on disturbance features. Not by measuring the processes directly, but rather looking at spectral indices that might be related to the recovery that's actually taking place on the ground. So we're going to be collaborating particularly with Jennifer Hurd in the ABMI, and also works in my lab on this. She's sort of one of the national experts on this subject. And essentially what we're doing is we're leveraging these long time series of satellite imagery that are now available on platforms like Google Earth Engine that makes it, quite accessible to process giant volumes of data and extract things from them that we really wouldn't have been able to do even just a few years ago. So this is an example here on the graphic that shows, a pre-disturbed forest, and then a forest harvest area appears. And if we look at it through the eyes of a remote sensing index, you can see that we might be showing, a large amount of vegetation here, and then it drops quite precipitously when the disturbance occurs. But then as we look at the archive through time, we can see that, we're seeing some spectral recovery taking place. And so what we want to know is, first of all, is this spectral recovery? Is this a good analog for the more physical recovery that we know is, or that we hope is taking place down there? So this is largely what this PhD student will be looking at. And I think we're going to do a variety of things. I mean, first of all, we want to understand the ground factors that affect spectral recovery metrics. And secondly, we want to figure out ways of doing this with sensors other than Landsat. So Landsat is the system that's got the longest archive. It's almost a 50-year archive right now, but it's got also sort of moderate resolution pixels. So this might work on a harvest area, or perhaps even a well site or a well pad. But the truth is that many of our disturbances are a lot smaller than that. So we want to crosswalk metrics that we get from Landsat time series to those that we get from other higher spatial resolution sensors. The one I'm particularly interested in is something called Planet Labs. So Planet Labs is a company that's launched, dozens and dozens of these little cube satellites that orbit in very low orbits and produce very, very high spatial resolution images. So these are 1 meter pixel sizes. Now, it doesn't have the same spectral resolution that like a big Landsat satellite has, but still it produces something like a combination of visible and near infrared measurements. So we want to know how does spectral recovery measured by that type of an instrument compare to spectral recovery measured by Landsat or a Sentinel satellite, something like that. And then, based on this understanding, we want to see whether we can use spectral recovery for remote restoration assessment on aerial features, and then spectral recovery for remote restoration assessment on linear features. Okay, the next project I'm proposing is a little bit different. And this I'm calling edge effects. So we know that industrial disturbances like roads and seismic lines change biotic and abiotic conditions on the lines themselves. But the extent to which these effects spread into the surrounding matrix is really largely understudied, I would say. So it's this lack of understanding that creates simplistic buffering rules, like the 500-meter disturbed habitat guidelines we see applied to woodland caribou. Now, I don't intend to address caribou habitat directly, but I do want to leverage remote sensing technologies to measure the extent and persistence of vegetation and hydrological disturbances around linear features in the Boreal. Now, some of the foundation for this work was provided by Caitlin Willier, a former student of Scott Nielsen's, who showed that roads have a damming effect in wetlands that can alter hydrology and resulting vegetation communities. You kind of get a little bit wetter on the upstream side, a little bit drier on the downstream side, although this pattern is complicated and it depends on a number of factors. But Caitlin kind of took a more field-based approach to these observations, and that limited her ability to observe things longitudinally or through time. So I'm thinking that we can observe this effect a little bit more directly if we're using, again, these sort of long time series of satellite imagery that are now available through Google Earth Engine. And I think that we can use this time series analysis approach that's really kind of similar to what I described in the previous spectral trajectory project to help inform understanding of linear disturbance effects on vegetation and carbon dynamics, and assist with restoration of assessments that are happening, really at these big geographic scales that we're trying to get at in BERA 2. Okay, the next couple of projects are now more related to detailed things happening on seismic lines. So I'm going to use the soil hydrology zoomed in look here to maybe talk about this. And this is another project that I think I had originally envisioned as a single student that's now been split on account of new collaboration and support from the Canadian Forest Service. So in this case, we're working with Anna Dabros to expand our use of remote sensing to measure and track factors associated with hydrology and carbon dynamics on seismic lines. So the first project, this what I'm calling, RS4A, plant functional traits, is associated with an evolution in the way plant communities are characterized. So the traditional way involves a taxonomic description of plant species, alongside metrics of perhaps their distribution and abundance. But these taxonomic identities don't necessarily describe the functional effects on things like carbon sequestration. So there's this complementary approach that's emerging in the literature that measures plant functional traits. And I think we've seen Maria already describe a little bit of that already with Scott Davidson's work. And what it does is it takes things like height or leaf area and rooting depth, and that's what gets measured and compared to on disturbance and off disturbance. We're proposing to kind of go a step beyond that though. And one of the ways that we will do this in this project is try and develop spectral traits as a means of characterizing plant and soil communities. So the reason why I think that there's some potential here is that, you know, the range of environmental gradients that we can characterize with modern remote sensing tools is enormous. It's exploding. And what we want to do here is fly remote sensing data alongside field personnel who are compiling these taxonomic and functional trait observations on the ground. And the hope is that these strategies will help provide a way to collect relevant environmental data in sites that are maybe not easily accessible to boots on the ground. And again, help us to scale up our assessments over big areas. This other project, this one I'm calling RS4B, will develop remote sensing approaches to track snow and hydrological conditions in and around seismic line. In this case, in close collaboration with Scott Ketchison and his students. So we know from previous work that seismic lines cause changes in microclimatic conditions, particularly in the shoulder seasons where, you know, lines might trap snow and, you know, affect the ablation of snow. We also know that, you know, disturbances change microtopography, and therefore online soil moisture conditions will be affected. So through this remote sensing work, we're hoping to help the soils hydrology team in their assessment of local water balances, water tables, soil water availability, and other elements of the system that, you know, Maria described in her presentation. Okay, finally, like the other teams, we also have plans for a postdoctoral fellow to come in, sort of in the middle to latter half of the project, to help us integrate the work of the graduate students. And really, I envision our student in this role doing two big things. First, we want them to help determine what metrics, that is, what things can we directly measure with remote sensings? And then what spectral indices, that is, things that we indirectly measure in ways similar to the spectral trait idea I just described. Which one of those things can be tracked reliably over space and time at the scale of this big study area that we're, you know, looking to scale up to? So that's the first big thing. And secondly, we want this person to contribute to these interlab collaborations that must take place, where we're going to use these metrics in indices that we develop through remote sensing to make these models and planning tools and layers that we are proposing as tactical deliverables for BERA 2, and make it happen at the scale of our entire study area. So I think that I am going to close here. Oh boy, I forgot these little animations. These are the things that we measure. These are the things that we use indices for. Okay, so I'm going to close and pass it back to Julia, and she can decide what we're going to do next.
Thank you very much, Greg. You just managed to finish in perfect time. It's 11:35, so we're caught up in the agenda. Thank you. Well, why don't we all just unmute ourselves and give the whole group a short applause. I think they all deserve it. Thank you all for your great presentations. That was, yeah. Okay, so we have about 20-25 minutes to wrap up here in terms of now letting the audience participate a bit more. We had a few questions, but so maybe what I'm going to do here is first sort of try and direct 5 minutes of direct questions to Greg about what he just had, you know, proposed and showed you, not proposed, what he's just told you what he's going to do. And then we'll maybe try and zoom out and any kind of questions you have. So let's start for 5 or 8 minutes with Greg, and then let's open it up to the overall group. So if maybe, and if there's lots of questions, raise your hand. If not, just unmute it. Yeah, Michael is one there. Please go ahead.
Hey, Greg, you mentioned that Landsat has the longest history. I don't know if you mentioned, though, whether or not we can use Landsat to age disturbances.
If we can see them, then yes, we can age them. Jen Hurd, I know is here. Jen, She's the one in the group that that we're looking to collaborate specifically on this. She's sort of one of Canada's experts on this subject. I wonder if you can maybe address Michael's question.
Sure. Nothing like being put on the spot.
There you go.
No, I'm happy to give some input. Basically, as Greg said, with Landsat, if you can see it, then yes, you can age disturbances. Landsat has a 30-meter pixel resolution, so it is difficult to look at those smaller features like seismic lines, especially the smaller low impact seismic lines with something like Landsat. So that does present a difficulty. I have been working a lot with harvest areas, and for those it works wonderfully. Those are big enough features that you can have a lot of Landsat pixels in a feature to look at. I think things like well sites are sort of are just big enough that you can get a few Landsat pixels and you can look at features like that. But yeah, it really does depend on the size because Landsat has that moderate resolution to it.
Thanks, Jen. Other sensors though, other spatial resolutions have different abilities, but it just doesn't have the near 50-year history that Landsat does.
I have a follow-up if that's okay.
Yep.
Yes, go ahead.
What platform would you then suggest for something like linear features, which are going to largely be missed by Landsat, or we just can't backcast and we have to rely on Sentinel-2 and moving forward with those data or something like that?
Yeah, so I don't know that we're going to be able to directly measure the timing of small features like Landsat. We're not going to be able to directly observe them. They're not going to be reliably appearing in the archive. But we've got other strategies that we're attempting. Even right now, actually, we're trying to use the forest line mapper, which is this tool that we developed in Boreal 1 that delineates linear features that might have been digitized sort of roughly in other linear databases. But we don't know much about them. We don't have a lot of attributes associated with them. We don't know their age, for example. But we want to see whether we can use machine learning or even deep learning approaches to see whether can we relate the patterns that we're seeing in those lines, like how wide they are and how convoluted they are, other things that the forest line mapper is pulling out of the LiDAR, and can we use that to predict the ages? Maybe not specifically what year they were in, but rather what era they were built in. So the ABMI, for some of their photo plots, they've assembled this information, but it's only for their photo plots. So what we're trying to do is see whether we can learn the patterns in the photo plots and then apply them extensively across larger landscapes. And I think that we'll probably be in a position to report on that here later this year.
Any other questions?
Lionel here. So, Greg, you mentioned the Landsat data, and you mentioned the Planet Labs cube satellites, which have high spatial resolution, but lower spectral resolution than Landsat, right?
Yeah, but also very high temporal resolution. I should have thrown that in. So Planet Labs is now producing a product that's daily 1 meter reflectance data. Daily 1 meter reflectance data. So they have so many satellites out there that there's so much overlap amongst the satellites. They're now in the position of producing cloud-free mosaics over huge areas on a daily basis. So that's really exciting. And we want to see like what value is there in a product like that for groups like ours.
I'm assuming that the lower spectral resolution of the Planet Labs partially makes them more affordable so that they can get more of those cube satellites up in orbit?
Well, affordable, we'll have to see. I mean, so Planet Labs will work with researchers on sort of a collaborative basis. So I'm thinking that we'll be able to use an academic program to get access to these data for free. I've not looked into what the commercial pricing on this is. I mean, they're a business. They're not like Landsat that just gives it away. So we'll have to assess that. But the first thing we want to do is see what value is there.
Okay, yeah, I'll get to my point. So are there any hyperspectral platforms that you're considering using? Admittedly, shorter time series than Landsat, but presumably they would both have high spatial, high temporal, and high spectral resolution.
Yeah,
So
there actually are no such things, Lionel. I mean, basically, when you're designing a satellite, you need to pick your poison. You can't be high spatial, high spectral, high temporal. You can't do everything. So you know, that's why that there are satellites that specialize. You know, some are high spatial, but they give up a little bit on the other side of things. Yeah, that's kind of just the way it goes with satellite remote sensing. The only way to do what you're describing is with, you know, airborne remote sensing or drone remote sensing, and that comes with its own set of challenges.
So there aren't any airborne hyperspectral missions within the overall study area that you could use, huh?
There's none that I would consider hyperspectral.
Okay.
Now, as you know, we've been flying lots of our own data. So maybe it's my bias, but my impression is that there's more value in combining LiDAR and any old optical data you can give me. That is a really powerful combination. I'm probably less interested in trying to push the things on the hyperspectral side of things. But again, that's maybe just my history speaking. But I'd rather use 4-band or 8-band optical data and then throw me some LiDAR or throw me some point clouds. I mean, that's the real additional benefit, I would say.
Yeah, in case you couldn't tell, I have hyperspectral on the brain because I just finished an online course on that.
Okay, then maybe, thank you, Greg, and thank you all for your questions to the remote sensing section. So why don't we now use the next 15 minutes? If anybody has, you know, questions that they couldn't ask before, or just sort of comments about, you know, what you've seen today for the whole program. So please raise your hand or unmute yourself and start asking. Eric Nielsen, would you like to start? I see your hand up, Eric. I don't.
Just before Eric speaks, I just want to point out that Shane has filled in my response to your question much better. So please take note.
Why don't you sorry, Eric, just 1 second. Then Greg, why don't you reread that for everybody to see better?
Yeah, Shane is pointing out something that I had forgotten. Several years ago, the UVic flew an airborne platform that had all of it, hyperspectral, optical, and LiDAR, all coincident. So it's a highly valuable data set that unfortunately we've not been able to tap into yet in BERA, but it's out there. I think that Shane is making this, or the governor of Alberta is making this available through their open data initiative. And that's probably something that we should think about using.
But as Shane also says, it's only small limited areas, so it probably won't cover our whole study area. But yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Eric.
No, thank you. Eric, now please to you.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for the great talks. This has been really, really awesome. I thought maybe I would just raise something that Greg got into a little bit, and this is something that Anna Dabros and I have chatted about a little bit, in this idea of edge effects along seismic lines, and how the actual impact of the line extends into the forest for certain metrics. And I think that as we get focused and concerned about things like biodiversity and invasive species and the effects of what kinds of restoration effects are useful, restoration treatments are useful, I just wanted to raise this as a bit of a discussion maybe about the need to redefine what we think of as restoration success, in that we want to be measuring into the bush a little bit, such that we're looking for plant diversity that's 5 meters, 10 meters off, that sort of thing. It raises a lot of different questions. So for instance, the total impact, the total area of disturbance really expands when you start to think about edge effects, especially if you're worried about invertebrate diversity or something like that. And I think another question is, we almost need to ask the question, how much does restoration on the line? So for instance, if you're talking about a conventional seismic, if you restore that 8 meters, do we see the kind of restoration knock-on effects in the forest? Is that something that is going to happen on its own, or do we need to start thinking about efforts that are off the line as well? And this is only going to be applicable for certain metrics, but for the ones that where that's relevant, we maybe want to start incorporating that. And I realize that I think about big mammals, so this is something that everyone on the call has probably already thought about, but I think it's a very kind of interesting challenge to say, we're not just talking about this footprint here. We have an attenuating effect going outward. So I just raised that as a way to sort of synthesize a lot of what has been said today. So I don't know who should respond. Anna, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. You really sort of spurred these ideas on when we were chatting about it before.
Anna, do you want to add anything?
I guess I just want to add that while there's more and more studies on edge effects, and especially edge effect of seismic lines, there's still, like, generally, it seems like it is still highly underestimated. And like recently, like in one of the review of my papers, like I just had questions like, who really cares? Like, let's look at what's happening on the lines, and that's the most important thing. You can't see edge effects just by like looking directly, like you actually have to measure them, or maybe actually sometimes you can measure them. So yeah, I think that's something that, like, I'm glad to see that it's receiving more and more attention, because there is now evidence, and like from just looking at different ecological impacts, including carbon, including plant diversity and abundance and composition, soil structure, moisture, and that's something that Maria has been looking at, and her team. So I think that's like one example of how this is important is like caribou habitat quality. So we know that like caribou avoid the lines, and the areas near the line, like, are they missing out because they're not venturing close to the lines? Like, is the habitat close to the lines actually deteriorated, or maybe there is actually less lichen or preferred forage of caribou? So maybe just by not going close to the lines, they're actually not missing out that much. So these are just kind of questions that make me, I don't know, something I've been thinking a lot about. So.
I'll throw. This is Aaron.
Sorry.
I was just going to throw in my response. I mean, obviously, edge effects have been of interest to me for a very long time, and I think what I'm trying to propose via the ARU method, which admittedly is bird centric, but I've been very disappointed with the ways we've tried to measure edge effects in the past. I just don't think they've had the precision to be able to really draw the buffers. And so, when we see stuff thrown up like 500 meters, it's based on absolutely nothing. I mean, it's a guess at best. And so I think I agree we need to quantify it. And I think there is also, like, there's a lot of data people have done on plants on edge effects in this region that's never been collated. A lot of it's not published. And that's actually another activity that probably could and maybe should go ahead. I'm just plugging in my headphones before my headphones die, so I'm stopping talking for a second.
Okay. Thank you.
Julie, I have a question.
Yes, of course, Todd. Please go
It's
ahead.
Todd. First of all, Greg and everyone else, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting morning. I've enjoyed the presentations, and it's neat to see Bera summarized in your first little talk there, Greg. A couple of questions. One, is anybody looking at the opposite of edge effects, and that's like refugia in undisturbed areas and potential sources for biodiversity to spread out and colonize the landscape? And the second one is looking at soil moisture. If anybody's able to, remote sense soil moisture and look at that as sort of a proxy for the seismic lines and whatnot. So anyways, I'll just stop there.
Scott, you're probably the best one to address the first.
So yeah, the question around the refugia on the forest to the seismic line, or
well,
I didn't quite get that.
So when I read about seismic lines, I often read about, the effect of the seismic line goes into the forest, and therefore, the edge is really wide. And maybe these edges are so wide that there is no undisturbed forest. But, is there an area that is actually undisturbed and can act as a refugia for things to colonize? Now, we've been doing that a bit with soil fungi, so I was just wondering.
Well, yeah, so the concept of interior forest kind of thing. And so to me, that's, one way of looking at it is if you take the oil sands region of all the oil sands, only 6% of it has, I know Greg doesn't like using the word footprint, but 6% of it has a footprint. Well, heck, that sounds like 94% of everything's left. That sounds like amazing. But the second you start buffering it and using these really crude rules like the 500 meter, like Aaron is saying, everything goes out the window and you pretty much have nothing left. But if you use other rules of thumb, like for, let's say plant responses, much like Anna Dabros has shown and others, then, then it goes from 6% disturbed or affected to, 19, 20% for plants, or it's actually a little less than that. I think it was 13% in the calculation we did. And then obviously caribou, it's 100% and this kind of thing. So again, it's the eye of the beholder. It depends a little bit, but the ability to recolonize the conditions on the disturbances over time is, this is the issue. It's kind of like what Greg was saying. The key is to look at recovery over time and the interaction of those effects relative to the landscape effects. So the landscape effects are going to be the total amount of surrounding footprints and densities and things like this. And then the age of the recovery of those lines is probably going to have some complex composite effect or interaction, especially with invasive species or other things that may be on the seismic line. So to me, it's that's still very much an open question, but presumably, yes, there's going to be especially species with small grain sizes, such as plants, once light conditions and the soil conditions, which probably are even slower, recover to some degree, you'd think that there'd be the opportunity to essentially recolonize. So there are these refugia effects. The problem is grain size of other species like mammals, there isn't, in the so-called interior forest is very, very minor to none. So it's more problematic for those species than it is for plants. But I don't know, that's my observation. Anybody else is welcome to throw something out there. And I think the other question was Greg was targeted for.
I had a question for Scott and Angelo, and I was curious whether there was a height threshold that you had used to qualify a tree for considering it as in your tree density metrics.
Well, this is the issue. So the issue is, honestly, I don't pay attention to restoration standards too much because honestly, I think they're extremely narrow and probably not very, there's not enough specificity to them, as I think I've been hinting at. So if you follow the restoration standards, I think it was 5 meters. So if you use that, yeah, it's going to take a lot longer to get there. And heck, some of the fens have 7-meter trees in the mature forest. Well, that's a really long time because you're asking it for it to recover almost to the same height as the adjacent stand. So what Angelo and I have been doing is just saying, well, heck with it. We'll show the trajectories of all possible heights, or divide them at 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter, 4 meter, and 5 meter, and demonstrate the time that you assume, or the time predicted to achieve those recoveries, given any of those thresholds. So basically try to create, rather than have a hard set rule, which we know cannot work for all species in all situations, and especially all ecosites, have more of the models that allow flexibility in what could be considered recovered, because it would vary depending on the eye of the beholder kind of concept. So there is no one right rule. And of course, the shorter you go, the easier it is to achieve so-called recovery, or maybe I like to think of it more as like you have a trajectory towards recovery. So you're getting going, which is which is a bigger issue. And to me, it's, you know, and even when people are like, whoa, there isn't that much recovery out there. Remember, the restoration standards are 1,000 trees per hectare. Angelo's plots are 30 meters long by 1 meter wide. As long as he found 3 trees in 30 meters, he met the restoration standards. What did
So
that
that was actually the comment I was going to make, is that, and I'll acknowledge my bias, I was one of the lead authors on the restoration framework. But one of the challenges is that I think we need to be using common language if we're going to compare these different thresholds on the same graph. So for example, if the reason why we need to hit 60 centimeters for a tree to count in the restoration framework is because that's when we have confidence that that tree has the potential to reach the canopy. So a tree that's 10 centimeters tall is good, but those trees live and die all the time. And so silviculturally and ecologically, we actually have more confidence when that tree has reached 60 centimeter threshold that it in fact can survive and it will reach the canopy. And so I think one comment or one observation I have from kind of like a practitioner perspective is that it's a little bit tricky if we're not using that common metric. If we're showing that the restoration framework threshold is 1,000 stems per hectare, and then we're saying that we have 10 to 100,000 stems in the field, I think we just need to make sure that we're using the same 60 centimeter mark to make sure that we're using common language. If we in fact have that out there, that's fantastic. But I think we need to be careful in how we're interpreting the passive versus active question if we're not using the same language.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's pretty easy to do in the 0.6 meter one, but we just went to 1 meter. And so there's estimates that, so you have to remember, you think of it this way, there was no single plot that didn't have 3 trees in it along 30 meters. So everything reached that part of it. So then the flip side is the second question is, but you need to reach a certain height, was the idea. So then that's where there becomes restrictions in which places have achieved that or not. So it's the dual combination of density and height. So definitely it's horizontal and vertical structure. But again, if we use the restoration standards, there was no place that didn't reach that part of it. So then it's all about, unless we change those so-called targets, then of course you're going to start getting more and more restrictions as you head up to like 10,000 stems per hectare. Then there's all these height thresholds, and that varies by ecosite. And it'd be pretty easy to just put a 0.6 meter on there if that's the one that's really believed. But to me, I think you need to get above even shrub level to really ensure, future recruitment into the forest. So even 0.6 meters, well, I guess they're well established, so it probably makes sense. But to me, there's still yet another one that until it really breaks out of the shrub level, it could still see a fair amount of competition and stagnation.
All right, sorry, I'm going to interject here. It's 12 o'clock sharp, at least here in Alberta. Thank you very much. I know, Greg, you were still going to respond to Todd, and I also saw another hand up. I don't know if we might have to take those questions over email, unless you want to make one more last comment, Greg, because you were kind of interjected. So I'll give you 1 more minute.
Yeah, no, and of course, and I'm happy to stay on a little bit further if anyone wants to. But so yeah, Todd, you asked about remote sensing of soil moisture. So there's a first of all, a lot of people who work on direct sensing of soil moisture, but this happens mostly in agricultural settings where you can actually see the soil with the sensor. So under those conditions, there's lots of work that shows that with microwave remote sensing, you can do it quite well. That's obviously not in the forest though. I mean, we can't see the soil directly, but we've sort of tried to approach this problem from a different perspective. And this, arises from some previous collaborations that I've done with Maria Strack that we sort of pulled into BERA a little bit. And we've come up with a strategy for not measuring soil moisture directly, but rather using remote sensing and then detailed terrain models to predict where the water level is going to be, the groundwater level. And there's, I don't have time to describe it here, otherwise we're going to go late, but there's a paper out there that describes our strategy for doing it. And I think that this is one of those tools that we're going to be bringing to BERA to try and, do things extensively that will assist the people working, intensively at their plots to, show it how at least groundwater level, which is an important factor for soil moisture and other things, vary across an entire plot or across an entire site. And maybe even at some point doing this with a tool like the Forest Line Mapper, across, many, many, many hundreds of kilometers of lines.
Thank you, Greg. So it is 12:03. I want to now just formally say, my goodbyes, and then I think we're going to stay on for a few more minutes for those of you who have a pressing question, but I think I would like to formally wrap up this webinar this morning first. So thank you all very, very much for coming here today. Really appreciate you joining us along this journey. Embarking on this new launch, on this new second phase. So really honored to have such a diversity of people here today. Thank you very, very much. Thank you also certainly all of you Bera PIs for your fantastic presentations today. With that, I will, release everybody, but obviously we'll stick around a little bit. But again, thank you very much. We will try and upload this webinar recording, I don't know, in the next week or so. And probably you'll get some follow-up correspondence about this. But yeah, other than that, thanks. Thank you all. And if you have any questions, email us. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Julia. Great job hosting.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, folks.
So yeah, anybody who wants to talk anything else, speak now or hold your peace. I know there were
We should
some
probably keep
super
the PIs here a little
discussions
bit
happening.
to talk about. We should probably keep the PIs here too to
And
talk
we should
about
keep the PIs here. That's right. Maria and Aaron and Scott. Oh, if we have already, maybe we've already lost Scott Nielsen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Boy's so
anyways,
skinny he needs food.
That's right. Any questions of you guys that are still here? Something you want to still pass on?
Julia, I was just musing about something. It wasn't really a question, so I just held off. But, we've often we're always focused on the disturbances on the landscape, I guess, as we've kind of needed to be. But should we be thinking about the stand, or let's say the eco site, as kind of the unit that we begin to work around? And it's something I think about, and I wonder when we're restoring sites if we shouldn't be restoring those patches rather than restoring features and then worrying about, the buffer around the feature, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, my bias comes from, when I studied forestry, that's how we learned how we might approach forest management, is by looking at the stand and treating that as a unit. So anyway, I just throw that out there, something I muse about.
I guess question would be, but we can talk about that some other time too, but I mean, I guess question is always definition of what is your stand. And in this case, your linear disturbance feature, almost, we don't want it. We want it to blend in with the adjacent stand, but really it's almost
exactly
form, but it is currently, depending on the state out there and where you are, its own stand almost, you could consider. It depends always on, how you map or perceive, right? Your
But
stand
maybe
delineation.
maybe you need to cut down the whole stand. Honestly,
no, but it's a question of scale, of course. Yeah.
I think that's Michael, this goes back to what you're saying, like on the edge effect thing, like we can put a buffer on and we could say that plants that's 50 meters either side is altered. So is it on a cut block. So is it on the edge of a fire. So that reality is true. So the question, again, that goes back to the metric of comparison. And how much of, I'm going to use a really poor word choice here, but degraded edge, how much of it is just, you're actually getting what you would get in a harvest block cut interface as well. And that then gets back to then the question of where forestry went, particularly alpac. So don't make so much edge, right? Make big ass cuts, cut down a lot of it, erase the footprint, and have the benefit of then where SAG-D isn't operational. where SAGD is not operational, then leave the forestry, have the forestry company stay out of there for a while they harvest in the places where they're getting rid of footprint. I mean, those are some of the arguments, and I mean, some of those ideas have been pitched in OSIM and other things like that as well. So we should talk some more about that for sure. But it gets into what you're comparing against. I mean, I think we're going to beat our heads against the wall forever to say, it's going to take 80 years for those trees to be the same height as the trees beside them because they're 110 years old. That's just the way it works. And, and then and I think one of the things I got out of today was I had some side conversations is words we need to use are recovering versus recovered. Those are not the same thing, right? And I think something's on the right trajectory to be doing what we would expect of natural disturbance dynamics or forestry dynamics versus it's recovered means it's the same as whatever's beside it. And those are quite different.
All right, guys, I think we all need a lunch. I just need the PIs here for a couple more minutes, but we will see you, Michael and Shane, and I think all of you in the afternoon, right?
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Julia.
Okay, see you soon at 1 o'clock. I will
Bye-bye.
send out the meeting link for that shortly. And I will